the first committee in common of Telford Wrekin CCG and Shropshire CCG. Today is National Emergency Services Day, so at 9 o'clock we're holding 2-minute silence for that, and then we'll start the meeting after that. So I've got 3 different times, but I'll wait till my iPhone says 9 o'clock, and then we can be quiet. I think most people are here. We'll go through the apologies later. I think we're just missing Paul, Shirley. Julie is in another meeting, just doing gold command for Dave, or gold call for Dave, so she'll be in at about 9:30. But if we have the 2-minute silence first, and I will tell you when it's 9 o'clock according to my watch clock. And welcome everyone. It's 9 o'clock now, so if we can start the meeting with a 2-minute silence to recognise the emergency services workers on National Emergency Workers Day. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's 2 minutes. Sorry about that, Mike. We should have pre-warned you. We're having 2-minute silence for National Emergency Services Workers Day. But anyway, welcome to the meeting. Just some basic housekeeping initially. This is obviously a COVID secure meeting. We're 2 metres apart. We are asked, though, if we do leave this room, as we did on arrival, to wear our masks. Refreshments will be served outside of the meeting room, and we'll be mindful to ask you to observe social distancing during the refreshments. And also, has everyone confirmed with reception their car registration and given their contact details? One, to avoid a parking ticket, and the contact details if there were to be a problem for the track and trace process. Good, I'll take it that everyone has. Apologies, we've got 3 apologies. We've got Paul Shirley, I think is due to be here, but he's not here yet. We've got Julie McCabe, who's the registered nurse for both CCGs, Rachel Robinson, the Director of Public Health from Shropshire, Liz Noakes, the Director of Public Health from Telford Wrekin, and Julie, as I say, is doing the Gold Command Call and will be joining us when she can, just after 9:30. So we'll probably move round her paper with Zena's paper. Zena's down there. Thank you. Declarations of interest, they've been declared to the website. There's a couple of changes from the ones on the website and that were initially circulated with the minutes. Adam Pringle has got some conflicts around on the list about the going to the locality meetings, but he doesn't, in his role, he's not attending the locality meetings. So they've been removed. There was it's a complex mistake, but basically I've removed from the conflict of interest about being a member practice of Darwin and being a director of Darwin. I've spent a whole year thinking I was, but a whole year not being. So I actually formally never was anything to do with Darwin. So I've removed those from the conflict of interest, which is why they've been removed rather than just ended, because they weren't conflicts in the first place, apart from in my mind. Thank you very much for, it is, you know, it's been a difficult, since our last board meeting in Shrewsbury, and there was one in Telford just afterwards, back in March. Obviously a lot's happened, and we've been meeting at distance for our teams, and today we're having a meeting in line with the government's guidance that allows meetings in COVID-secure venues for businesses of up to 30 people, and including our support crew, which we're very grateful for being here from Source, and obviously our comms team and Sandra. We are under 30 people. So thank you to the Mercure Hotel for sorting the arrangements out for us. It's the first time we've met as a board face-to-face, so obviously we are two boards. We are the board for Telford Wrekin CCG, and we're also the governing body board for Shropshire CCG. So this is technically a committee in common, so it means that both boards are meeting separately, but at the same time discussing virtually the same agenda, the only difference today being the minutes in relation to the previous board meetings and the matters arising from those, which and the BAFs, which will, the board assurance frameworks, which will be brought together following this meeting. So the next meeting there will only be obviously one board assurance framework. I'd like to thank all our staff and also all the health and social care workers for their efforts and the work they've been doing over the last few months. And as we know, cases are beginning to rise, and that coming into winter, that hard work and that change in work is likely to have to continue. So obviously we're not sure how future meetings will, whether they can take place, but hopefully with the new restrictions that are announced today, the rules for businesses and meetings like this will stay the same, and hopefully we'll find this of benefit. And I think certainly is the fact that we've actually not physically met in one room as a board. I think it was the right thing to do today. Although I must admit, last night I did start to worry a bit, and actually Googled and photographed on my phone the national guidance, and then reread it a couple of times to make sure that I hadn't misread it. But I trust Alison would have advised me if I had done. So that's all I was going to say as introductory comments, and then we'll move over to Dave, who's going to give some brief introductory comments and an update.
Thank you, Julian.
Sorry, can I say one more thing?
Yes, of course you can.
I promised I would say this, didn't I? That microphones aren't on all the time for everyone because it's a big room, and the feedback, I can't believe this slipped my mind because I wrote it down just 2 minutes ago. So when you're about to speak, if you could raise your hand, then light source will know who's about to speak, and they can make sure your microphone's turned on. Otherwise, there is a risk that when you start to speak, that you won't be heard by everyone. So if you could indicate you're going to speak, and then your microphone will be turned up. And just to confirm, everyone can. I think we did a microphone test at the beginning, and we could both hear each other from each end of the room. So I'm assuming everyone can hear this reasonably clearly. Lynn, you're the furthest away, and Steve. Yeah. No, that's brilliant. Thank you. So if we start with Dave, sorry.
Thanks, Julian. Clearly, everyone might be able to hear, but I might need to get my glasses checked in future, I think, looking at the far end of the room. There's just a couple of things I wanted to update board members on in terms of things that are happening. Clearly, the Improvement Alliance for the Acute Trust with UHB has started. We've not seen the management agreement because that's commercially in confidence. However, I have had quite a long conversation with Dave Rosser, who's the Chief Executive of UHB, and made him aware that both the CCG and the system are supportive of the approach, and offered any help that the CCG and system will be able to offer them moving forward. There is a new Director of Nursing in South now, who was the Deputy Director of Nursing at UHB. She has started. There is also an Associate Medical Director, and it's their Transformation Director, or her background as a Chief Operating Officer, are also coming across to help the South team. The overall improvement team, as part of NHSEI's service offer to South in terms of improvement, have started. That's quite a large team, with Suzanne Rosser starting as the Improvement Director. We will update the board in due course once we get more information through on the work that's taking place. The NHS England Committee sat yesterday to consider our application to bring the two CCGs together. We haven't heard how that went. My understanding is they will make a recommendation to the NHSEI board, who will consider that in due course. We haven't got a date for that yet, but I'm going to chase some people today, and if I can update board members before the end of the meeting, I will do. If not, we'll send a note round as soon as we possibly can. We had a system review meeting with NHSEI last week with all system partners and the regional team of E&I. It was a bit of a game of two halves, I have to say. There were some good bits in there. There are some bits that need further work on, and we are doing that now. In relation to part of it, we have got a phase 3 plan meeting with NHSEI colleagues on Friday of this week. And Steve, Sam and Julie are working hard on the preparation for that at the moment. There was just one other thing I wanted to bring up in this part, which was the N365 procurement. We have a slight governance issue in terms of under the Constitution at the moment, because we've run a mini procurement exercise, the governing body needs to sign it off, and there is a matter of urgency in terms of signing it off, and therefore it can't wait to the next governing body. There is a small financial impact in terms of this for the Trust. Essentially, it means that all of our primary care practices will be on the N365 network. If we didn't do that, the financial consequences for the CCG were much greater than that, because it would have stayed on the old N3 connection, which was being discontinued by E&I and NHS Digital nationally. So we had to do it in that sense, and I would ask the governing body to enable Julian and I, as Chair and Chief Exec, to take Chair and Chief Exec's action outside of this meeting to sign that contract off.
Is everyone happy with that? Is that Dave and I take it out? I only found out on Monday evening that it had to come to governing body, and I thought it was too late to actually do it justice to actually produce the papers at that point. And a decision needs to be made by the 15th, isn't it?
It says yes.
So there's no objections to that, then Dave and I will make that decision later on today outside of the governing body. Thank you. Anything further, Dave? Or?
No, that's it, but happy to take any questions.
Do you have any immediate questions on Dave's update, mindful of obviously what the other papers that were coming through, so some of the immediate things that came up that won't be coming up in any of the later sections? Meredith.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dave. Two things. First of all, thanks for saying that the CCGs are supportive of the approach being taken with the Alliance. Are we clearer about what that approach is? Just to be clear, I am obviously supportive, but is there clarity about the approach being taken? And I remember you saying that there were 10 objectives being set, and I just wondered if we'd got clarity about those. And secondly, I'm just going to move my microphone a bit. Secondly, the game of two halves, that sounded encouraging. Can you tell us more about some of the good things and maybe some of the areas for improvement that, or to work on that we can be aware of?
Dave, will the improvement plans come up with Zena's quality report, or is the...
It probably... Are you bringing it up, Zena, or not?
The Getting to Good programme's detailed. The suite of director support is indicated in the slide set, but the actual 10 objectives are still being refined, as I understand.
So should we discuss that at Zena? Meredith, do you mind if we put that on hold until we've had the rest of Zena's report, and then they can deal with the game of two halves?
Yeah.
So in terms of the game of two halves, Meredith, the things that I think we were favourably seen in the spotlight from NHSEI were around looking at our restoration in terms of separating elective and emergencies went down well. The work that we've been doing around LD and autism and trying to get that back on track played out well. The overall work around the ICS development played out well. I think where we were less good is around our phase 3 recovery projections, and where we currently are don't look as good as some other areas. And at the moment, an early indication, but it is only a tip-off I got yesterday, is that we may be ranked 42 out of 42 systems in the country. Now, clearly, I've had conversations with system partners and our own team yesterday to look at what we can do before the meeting on Friday to get us into a better position. I think it may be that we were conflating a number of issues in terms of the ask, if I'm honest. I think what we need to do is answer the question that was asked, and the question that was asked is, how do you, if you go back to the phase 3 letter, how do you get to a series of targets? So, for example, elective restoration in terms of elective surgery by the end of October. I think we've conflated that with, well, we can get so far, but the problem is winter's coming, and that's going to give us a problem. Now, I don't think winter coming is part of the question, and therefore I think we need to be really clear that we're just answering the exam question, and that may be the mistake we've made.
Find out.
Mike.
Sorry, I can't hear. If the microphone's not close to you, all I heard, sorry, when you were talking was hit and miss, I'm afraid. So I do apologise.
You don't need to necessarily move the microphones, do you? We can adjust that at the end.
Thank you.
It's the sort of technical bit, I think. So moving the microphone and turning up the volume might result in a bit of feedback, I would have thought. So I think if we try and keep the microphones where we are, but if there is continued problems, Mike, just let us know. Just signal it, and we'll do that. Any further questions, John?
Thanks. Just a minor point. I'm not sure if it's covered later, but on the conflict of interests declarations, and you said there'd been some minor adjustments, so it may have already been covered. But I noticed that the general practitioners in partnership, that their partnerships seem to be varied between whether it was a level 1 or a level 2 classification. So it might just be need to see whether they need to be standardised.
Oh, obviously, clearly they should be the same. Yes, yeah. So, Alison, can you make a note of that, and we'll have a look at that and update that. Thank you, John.
Sorry, Julian, there probably is one other thing I should have updated on in the AO's briefing, which is the system improvement plan. Governing body members will recall that at the end of July, there was a system to NHS board meeting as a result of some of the concerns, particularly in relation to SATH. The system was written to, there were 4 key areas that were highlighted in the letter from Amanda Pritchard, which were around CQC, culture within SATH and leadership was one. A second one was around Ockenden. A third one was around HTP, and he's trying to frantically remember what the fourth one was because it's gone completely out of my brain at the moment, but I will come back to it. So there is an expectation that SATH will produce a quality improvement plan, and I'm sure Zena will touch on that later, but there was also a requirement within the letter for, the fourth one was ED, including the estate. There was a requirement within the letter, and Neil McKay was tasked with it, of a system improvement plan to be developed as to how the system could work with and help SATH to achieve improvements in those 4 key areas. That system improvement plan is being developed as we speak. The intention is that there will be a fairly finished draft by the end of this month to go back to NHS. The conversations I've had with people are, I think we need to focus how do we help around the CQC concerns around quality, apart from the work that Zena and her team are doing, obviously, is around how we manage demand and how we can try and control demand in key areas, and think 111, NHS 111 first is part of that. I think the HTP is probably a pushback to NHS to say, actually, SATH need the money to develop the outline business case, and that's what's stalling that at the moment. I'm not sure there's much the system can do around Ockenden, and the fourth part around the workforce. We already have safeguarding support going in from the CCGs. We've also got the Mental Health Trust providing additional support and have seconded someone into the Trust for 6 months to help with some of the aspects of the Mental Health Act and DOLS, etc. We will bring that report or the improvement plan back to governing body in due course. Sorry, I should have mentioned that.
For the new members, can you just, in one word or one sentence, say what HTP and Ockenden obviously are, just for...
Sorry, yes. So HTP is a hospital transformation programme. It's future fit as was. So when the CCGs were developing the case for reconfiguring acute services, it was future fit. As it's now been handed over to the Trust, it's hospital transformation programme. The Ockenden review is the independent review into maternity at SATH as a result of some high-profile cases, and is due to report in December.
Thank you, Dave. Any further questions? I think the accountable officers reported the new thing for Shropshire CCG, and I think we're discussing about whether that may be written for future meetings, but today it was just a verbal update. So we're going to move on now to looking at the minutes of the previous meetings. We'll deal with both minutes first and then move on to the matters arising. Because I wasn't present at the Telford and Wrekin board, Dave is just going to lead on the items on the Telford and Wrekin CCG governing body minutes and the matters arising. But if we first of all go through the Shropshire, for those who are there, the Shropshire CCG minutes, if we check them for accuracy and correction. So first off from page 1 of the minutes through to page 5. If I miss anyone when they put the hand up, please just speak. Then from page 6 through to page 10. And then page 11 through to page 15. Claire, sorry.
Just a small matter of accuracy. At the bottom of page 13, 11.12, the very last sentence on there says the broader piece around the budget was complicated because there was an underlying issue with the CCG's delegated primary care budget. I think we need to put a full stop there and remove relating to a backlog from last year, because that's not factually quite correct. And then also, as it trips onto the next page, it says, and the CCG had been subsidising the balance of spend to its programme budgets, but it should say from its programme budgets.
Okay, Sandra, are you happy to make those changes, remove those words, add a full stop and put of in there?
Thanks.
Thank you. And then pages 15 through to the end, which is page 20. No, if not, we'll accept those as an accurate record with those changes to be made. Dave, did you want to do the Telford and Wrekin?
Thanks, Julian. So if we move on to the minutes of the Telford and Wrekin board held on Tuesday the 14th of July, please. If I take those first for accuracy, pages 1 to 4. Pages 5 to 8. And 8 to 10. Thank you, we'll sign those off.
With the matters arising, Dave and the exec team have been through the matters arising, and with the slight change also to into the new aligned constitutions, some of the actions that were for the board have been deemed more appropriate to be held by the by subcommittees. The other thing attached to going back to the Shropshire minutes was obviously the patient questions, and those are attached for information for everyone. So unless anyone's got any questions with regards to the patient, the submitted public questions from the Shropshire board. Keith.
I just was interested in clarifying the timetable for when the governance processes for the out-of-hours review were going to go through.
Dave?
Still working on those, Keith, at the moment, but it won't be much longer, I have to say, because that is getting wrapped up now.
Thank you.
I also did feel, with regards to some of the comments about them not having been through our governance process because they weren't signed off, I think it probably needs to reach a point where they go through our governance process, whether or not the provider agrees with them or not really. So I think they do need to come through. So,
wanted to comment on or provide further information for the board around the actions and it's I think it's on the Shropshire one.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll go through the actions now.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I jumped back to those. So the actions have been reviewed and some of them are complete and some of them have been moved on to the other committees' agendas as in line with the new constitution. First one is the minutes were complete. The second one, which was about the MSK Alliance, and it's been thought that the best place to bring that to is the Joint Strategic Commissioning Committee, which is going to be subject to later discussion. Is going to be one of the committees of the CCG. The next one is complete around transform midwifery care and writing to NHS England.
It's worth letting the governing body know that we did write and we have had a response from regional colleagues who are taking it up nationally.
Thank you. Mike?
So I'm completely confused now.
Sorry, Mike.
So why you say you sent these things to other committees?
No, that's a different thing. So there's some things have been taken off as actions from when we've tried to amalgamate both boards, matters arising and actions. They have been deemed under the new constitution as we're changing how some of the other committees are working to be more appropriately dealt with in some of the subcommittees, so in the Joint Strategic Commissioning Committee. The one that we've written about was the action that for Dave and myself to write to NHS England with regards to the time frame and the frustration it's bringing about the progress around the transforming midwifery care, which is the review of the rural midwife-led units. And Dave completed the letter and sent that to the region, and the region have replied. So that's the matter that Dave was talking about.
So for example, the MSK Alliance, you say you've been moved to another committee. How are we as people who are trying to assure going to know what the results or outcomes? Are we going to get the papers for this or what? Because it's all right sending them to another committee, but I thought as a board, we overall, in our role as assurance, we need to know what was going on in the other different departments. So how is that going to work, and how are they going to feed back to us so that we can actually do the job, which is of assurance, to make sure that this is being done properly and appropriately?
So within the day-to-day business of the CCG, what has been agreed in the new constitution and the principles we're working to is that the board sets the strategy and the agenda and provides the assurance, but some of the board's functions are delegated to other committees. So we have a audit committee, we have a quality and finance committee, performance committee, and we have the Joint Strategic Clinic Committee, Joint Strategic Clinical Commissioning Committee.
So,
and
that still doesn't answer my question.
But it does, because we're as a governing body, we've delegated some of that responsibility for seeking assurance to other subcommittees. Alison, I'm sure, is much better placed to explain that there isn't a clinical in the JSCC, it's Joint Strategic Commissioning Committee. But Alison, do you want to...
Yes, sorry. So just to clarify, Mike, when the committees obviously deal with that business on their agendas, after each meeting, the chair of each of those committees will submit a report to the governing bodies, summarising, obviously it won't be in great detail, but it will be summarising the discussion, any decisions that have been made, so that the governing bodies have that overview of what's happening in the committees and what delegation they're taking on behalf of the governing bodies. So you will have that oversight through these meetings of the governing bodies from those chairs' reports.
So when will we be discussing these on the board then?
You won't, because
Well,
the
what's the
board
point
have
then?
delegated some of its decision making to specifically the Joint Strategic Commissioning Committee to make the decisions on its behalf. And then there are other delegations around policy approvals, strategy approvals, which are in the Constitution and then also reflected in the terms of reference of each committee.
No, I understand that bit. But the point is that how, as a board, are we meeting to get the papers that have been sent through so we can look at them and make sure they've been formally assured? Or are you saying that the assurance is going to occur at the meeting? Sorry, I'm getting a little bit confused here. Am I being thick or something? But
No.
But I'm
This is all new.
It's all right. I don't mind everything like that. It seems quite sensible. But I thought, as a board member, we need some assurance now. Certainly at certain committees that there will be one of us there, so we would take it as assurance. But I'm just asking how we do feedback to the rest of the board about these meetings of some of the papers that have been provided, so that everyone knows what's going on. Because in some respects, just one person on the board really should, there should be overlap so everyone knows what's going on. So I'm just trying to clarify, if you move all this to the committee, how does the finished article reach the assurance board to make sure that we know what's going on and that things are progressing?
So that committee that it goes to is the assurance committee that we've delegated that responsibility to. So the work will be done by the executive team and by input from clinicians into the design of something.
Do we not need to know if we're on the board? Do we
will
not
be
need to
coming
know
back.
what the final result is?
Well, the final result will be reported through the chair's reports, but clearly on the different committees...
Which goes where?
Here, to the governing bodies.
Right.
And
so that will be a separate report, not one of these things?
No, it will be a separate report. So
Right,
much like we've got at the moment on this agenda for part 1 at the bottom, we've got them for information this time because we are consolidating chairs' reports from 2 governing bodies. But going forward, the committees will be meeting at the same time with the same agendas. So the chair's report will cover both governing bodies' business and we will have them on the agenda. And they'll be in part 1 as well, so they'll be transparent and open to the public as well to scrutinise. But clearly what we've tried to do with the committees is have the right level of both clinical and non-clinical involvement and composition of those committees so that we've got, in essence, a mini board in terms of the experience and the technical ability that's been brought to those committees, just as we have in the governing bodies that we have around the table today, so that you will have clinical input, but you'll also have non-clinical input to get that balance, hopefully, of decision-making where it's appropriate, but also assurance.
No, that's great, because that's what I want. I want it clear, because I'm still trying to work out the pathways of how these things work. And at the moment, it's all very new, so all the changes... it's not very clear, so that's why I wanted to make sure was that there is some sort of idea of a pathway through, so it is not just kept in a corner and no one else knows about it, but there is a designated pathway for this information to be shared. So that if that's happening, then that's fine.
I'm happy to have a conversation outside the meeting, Mike. If you
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Alison. The next action, I'm not sure whether it's complete. It's the... Meredith, sorry.
Fine. Thank you, Dave. Information about the letter going to the region regarding the transforming midwifery care. I'm pretty disillusioned to hear that it's been escalated to the national team. My worry is that a letter will come back and saying something like, well, we're not in a position to make a decision about this at the moment, and then we're going to have another 6 months or 12 getting nowhere. So I know you can't make an absolute precise view on what's going to happen, but did we put enough in the letter to express the need for an urgent decision and the pressure that has been built up and continues to build around this issue?
I was very clear in the letter, Meredith, around the continued impact of the delay on the ability to go out to public consultation, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I do need wide-angle glasses as well, so please do, Deborah, thank you for pointing out those questions. Any further questions up to this point, or we'll move on to the next matter arising, which, as I said, isn't clear whether it's complete. It's with regard to concerns raised by Shropshire Health Watch on behalf of patients, and to address the concerns. And there was due to be a meeting between Lynn Crawley and and Helen Bailey. Zena, is there any?
I've got a meeting in the diary with Zena actually to take this forward. So just because of diaries, it's taken a little while, but it is in the diary now.
Good, so there's a meeting date fixed, yeah.
Yeah.
Zena?
Yeah, and just in the meantime, I think Maggie Bailey informed me that she has met with you separately, Lynn, to discuss certain issues of concern. I'm not party to the details of those.
As well, I did try to meet with her, but she thought the Health Watch CHC meeting was that meeting, but for me it was a separate meeting, so I haven't actually met with Maggie specifically about that.
So Lynn and I have a commitment to meet anyway. That's the main thing.
Thank you. Yeah.
Then move on to section 0.75, which was the first question is complete about the reviewing the process for receiving and responding questions to the public. Will we have some communication with regards to that at some point? When would we expect to publish that, or Alison?
We've looked at the operation of other CCGs in terms of how they deal with questions from members of the public that happen in quick succession, meeting after meeting, that are around exactly the same issue. And we have had that on 2 separate occasions now for Shropshire CCG. And generally, it looks like other CCGs tend to operate a system whereby they won't accept the questions from the public around the same issue within 6 months on the basis that they publish, obviously, the responses to previous questions within that time frame. So we're looking at adopting the same process ourselves, and we'll be doing that this week and next week and publishing it on the website.
So that'll be in operation for the November meeting. November meetings. Thank you. Next one was the circulation of the public questions. That was completed and done. The next action, 7.6, was for Rachel Robinson, was to come back to the CCG to confirm if there's any further up-to-date information on antibody testing for Shropshire patients, and that was circulated to members on the 9th of July. We then move on to questions 0.78, matters arising. There's a matter arising for Julie, who isn't here. Dave, are you able to update on where we're sharing the data on the ambulance crew on scene timings and the data that was going to be double checked on page 10 of the performance and quality report?
No, Julian. Can we pick those up when Julie comes in?
Then there was an action with regards for Zena Young to look at how we can assess patient experience when looking at harm, and there's been a publication by NHS England with regards to that. Is that right, Zena?
Has just come out. It refers in the main to RTT, which is not the kind of full suite of information that we need to look at. I'm aware that South in particular are looking at their harm review process in all of its facets, really. So it's not just the RTT, it's the experience in ED, it's delays there, it's harms due to incorrect or missed or delayed treatments. So that's a piece of work for South. I think there is some work that perhaps we need to think about as a CCG around long waiting lists, not least because of COVID, but in any case, around delays to services of a non-physical care nature. So I'm thinking things like the speech and language therapy, long waits to access mental health services, and the test of harm that would be applied in those cases would be if an individual either has come to harm or is therefore requiring additional services or treatments or interventions at a higher level than if they'd met the constitutional standards for access to services.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. We then move on to there was an action that's complete, which was to review the structure of the performance and quality report for presentation to future meetings, and there's a new version of the report that's coming to today's meeting, so that's complete. On the next page, there's some final actions, which I think some of them aren't completed fully on the minutes correctly. So the Ms Parker to include waiting list numbers and timescales for the ASD and ADHD pathways in the SEND report, and the update on the new ASD and ADHD pathway, and then the final action on the sheet, which was to have a report about assurance around SEND that says on the actual action log it's coming to the agenda for the 9th to 9th. I assume all three of those actions are going to the Joint Strategic Commissioning Committee, is that correct?
Yes.
So that just needs to be updated on this sheet to reflect those three actions are actually going to the JSCC. Okay. We then move on to action materialising 0.80, and that was to review the current board assurance framework to see further improvements could be made, and that review's complete. And is there any comments about that? Or is it just we've got the board assurance frameworks coming, and then presumably at the next meeting we'll have a single one, so that's complete. And again, those final actions on the update on the SEND report, they will be coming, an update will be coming to the Joint Strategic Commissioning Committee. That's fine, yeah. So, John.
Yeah. Thanks, Julian. It was just slightly back to Mike's point, I guess, those three areas that are going to be transferred over to the JSCC. Just the process around that. Is it because there are commissioning decisions relating to those items that are pertinent for those actions to be transferred to the JSCC, or are they being transferred for a separate conversation at the JSCC, particularly the ASD and ADHD pathways? I'm just interested as to why they've been moved to that forum.
I didn't quite understand the difference between the two bits, or I was not. Why is it being transferred? Why is it being transferred?
I can understand if the JSCC has a piece of work in process looking at ASD, ADHD pathways, and that might tie into it. That makes sense. But if the JSCC hasn't got that specifically as an agenda item, a piece of work looking at the commissioning of that pathway at a point of time, why have those items been transferred for discussion at the JSCC?
So I think part of it is when we reviewed the way both, it's bringing together a broad answer, and then I'll ask Dave and perhaps Claire or Zena to answer the specifics. But on the broad basis, when we looked obviously the previous CCG boards have agreed and signed off the constitution, although there is some discussion about that later on today, and we're having ongoing discussions, and it's obviously not fixed in stone, but obviously when we looked at the different way the CCGs worked, things were done, it was sort of, although both CCGs were doing the same work and the same assurance, they were doing it at different levels in different committees. And so I think the process has been aligned so that the board will focus on the key areas of strategy and the key areas of assurance, and when some of those other some of the other work around asking some of the questions around those, the work streams is going to be done at the committee, similar to the way that it's always been done at the finance committee, has provided a greater level of sort of a more detailed sort of interrogation of Claire around the finances, and then presents a report back to the CCG board, as well as having a finance paper that comes to the board, that we're moving some of that detailed, challenging questions out of the governing body into the various subcommittees. And I think we're then assuming that some of the other work that perhaps sometimes was done in some of our subcommittees, particularly in Shropshire beforehand, shouldn't really have been done in a sort of formal subcommittee of the governing body, but should have been work that had been done further down the organisation as part of the development of the plans, and that when they came to the subcommittees, they should have been coming in a more ready form for assurance, and then when it comes back to the governing body, it comes back as a report from the committee describing the areas of work that those other subcommittees have looked to get insurance about. Is that, Alison, is that...
Okay.
And then particularly around then we'll go on to the particular question around the sand one in a minute.
Yes. Okay.
Alison, is there a better way of explaining what I've...
I think that's a good summary. Just generally about those particular issues, the Joint Strategic Commissioning Committee does have within its remit commissioning and the functions of commissioning, and obviously pathway development is a significant part of the commissioning process. And I think that's probably what's on this particular action list has prompted the movement of those particular items to the Joint Strategic Commissioning Committee. I'll look to Claire and Steve to correct me if I'm wrong. I think probably we do have a discussion later, and maybe what we need to focus on in that discussion is where perhaps the governing body wants to retain some oversight and assurance specifically on particularly areas of concern and risk over and above what the Joint Strategic Commissioning Committee will be doing in terms of discharging the commissioning decision making. And I think that's an area of discussion that we probably need to talk through.
Okay. And Dave, in particular about the SEND report, what's the reason that we've moved that for, I mean, maybe that Claire or Zena answers the question, but why we've moved that into the, away from the governing body into the Joint Strategic Commissioning Committee?
It's because the whole thing was wrapped up as part of the overall SEND work, including the pathway development. It was felt that was the most appropriate place for it to be discussed, but I don't know whether Claire wants to come in.
Claire, do you want to? And then to go back to John, and then Adam's got a question for after John.
I
Claire.
suppose it's under the new remit of the governing body, it's about separating out where the operational and detail discussion happens around the pathways, but the assurance will still come here. So, for instance, the written statement of action, which is not ready yet because of just timings with changes of the meeting, will go to the Strategic SEND Partnership Board next week, and that will still come back to the governing body for oversight and assurance, but the detailed discussion around the pathway and the commissioning for the future will happen at the LD&A board and at the Strategic Commissioning Committee. So that's the plan for the future.
John, yeah.
Yes, that's an interesting phrase that you used there, Claire, about the operational aspects. And really, I mean, the focus of my question really particularly around the action point here, which is waiting list, to include waiting list numbers and timescales for the ASD and ADHD pathways, is that's, to my mind, is a quality issue, and we discuss quality here and have a quality report. I wasn't sure that was an operational, we're not designing something new here or commissioning something new. It's something that has been commissioned and is in use by our patients, and so it was really to have sight quality, and it's whether quality and operational issues are going to be discussed at the subcommittees, or whether and which bits of quality will still come here, and that was really the focus of my question. I understand the process of delegation to subcommittees. It's just what is delegated and what isn't.
So I think probably the way I would see that, you're right. The waiting list figures should be coming through in two aspects. One is through the performance report, and one is through the quality report. So I think you're right. I think it's the fact they've all been grouped together into the SEND report. I don't think it would be coming in that form as a single item on SEND, but I think you're right. We should have an expectation that if one of our significant areas of weight/risk is around assessments within that pathway, then that must appear both in the performance and in the quality report, showing that there are issues with that and what steps we're taking to address that. Because obviously the significant issues should be coming to the board, so the 52-week weights, the increasing, if having problems in certain areas, and the big consequences like the 12-hour trolley breaches. So they should be coming to the board as part of the report. So no, I would agree that I would have an expectation that within the quality and the performance report, we should be seeing information about the impact of the long waits. But the pathway that you use and the process, the commissioning pathway about how we resolve that, I think should be coming to the Joint Strategic Commissioning Committee and to the structures below that. So yeah, no, I understand the question. I don't think I fully understood the question to begin with. Thank you. Adam?
My thought is that if we've got stuff in our action list that we're now passing on to other parts of the organisation, should, for completeness, that not then come back to us from that subcommittee as a report on the quality, to resolve the quality issues within those actions, if that makes sense? if we give it to somebody else and then don't follow it up, does that not just disappear into the swamp and there's no governance in that at all? If you see what I mean?
Sort of. I don't think it's disappearing. It's still within the CCG, but I think it should also, as Alison's already articulated, each of the subcommittees will be bringing a report back with a chair sheet.
So
and you would have thought the significant things within that should be coming back. So some of the aspects within, we should see some of that coming back.
So should those actions not stay alive and be completed when we get that report, if you see what I mean? That the report that contains the relevant items is the completion of those items?
Alison or Dave, I defer to you.
I might defer to Alison on that one. Well, I might do, but I'll come back to that. But I just wanted to pick up something around John's, because I think what we need to recall is part of the reason we are doing a SEND report is because there was inspection into SEND, which included the CCG. There were some actions that we needed to do arising out of that. And I think it's the way the actions reported, John. I think included in the overall report around SEND, you would include things like the waiting list numbers as well as the new pathways. But that's not to say that they shouldn't be reported in the normal way through to the governing body in terms of performance and quality. I'll hand over to Ali for the second point there.
So I think we've made an assumption that the actions would just be given over to the committees and that would the outcome of those discussions or action, etc., or escalation back would be part of the chair's report. Clearly, we're in a period of time at the moment where we've got two governing bodies and actions, etc., historically that we need to bring together and tie loose ends up. So I'm happy that we keep those actions on the two governing body action list where appropriate, and in order to make sure that we tie those loose ends up, leave them live. And then, obviously, we would expect reports back through the chair's reports to correlate with the live action still on the governing body action list. I don't think that's unreasonable, really, in the circumstances that we are at the moment.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that, Madam. Thank you. We now move on. Lynn and Claire, sorry.
I just wanted to, while we were talking about membership of committees, the committees themselves, I just wanted to ask if there can be a conversation with both Health Watch about our membership on any of the joint committees. I'm just really keen to continue to be involved in any of the quality committees, because as Health Watch Shropshire we've really benefited from our involvement in that committee and identified opportunities for us to do any public engagement that can support the CCG going forward. So I'd just like us to have that conversation about where we might best fit going forward.
Sure, and I think that there's an item later on the board about some of the current proposed changes. They say the Constitution is, it needs to be sort of tested and challenged and developed as things progress towards a single CCG. Was there another question down there, Claire?
It was just a response, Chair, that I've got the figures for the ASD weights, if the governing body would like to have them so that they're minuted here.
Yes, yes, we can have them now.
So as at May 2020, there were just over 100 children and young people waiting over 12 months, and the total on the list is 174.
Okay. And presumably that's going to be in the quality and performance report, is it around, there's some aspects of that in there, because obviously we might have some questions around that. So if we can hold off any questions around that until the quality and performance, because obviously that's still... just have there are a number of children who have been waiting for a long time for their assessments. We now move on to the matters arising from Telford and Wrekin's governing body, and also I've noticed that just welcome to Paul Shirley as well. I think he's arrived. Thank you. Welcome. Sorry we started. But welcome. Dave, there's two actions from...
Yeah, the first one, Claire, I'm not sure with COVID whether that's taken place yet, has it? The meeting with Patient First?
No, it's in the diary.
Thank you. And the second action was around reviewing the regularities of the new committees and whether they remain. That's been dealt with as part of the development of the constitution of the two CCGs moving forward.
Thank you. Before we move on, obviously Julie has returned, and because we're running a little bit behind, we actually can ask Julie her matters arising rather than it was part of matters arising. Julie, within the matters arising, on matters arising 2020-07-078, there were two matters arising. One was around the data on ambulance crew on scene timings, and one was around double checking the data quoted for Q2 on page 10 of the previous board's performance and quality report.
Yeah, with regard to the first query, the data from the West Midlands Ambulance Service has been requested. We've been told that we'll have the data from July. We've asked for it to go back to April, and as yet we haven't had a date for when we'll receive that, but I've set the expectation that I expect to be able to report that back to the next governing body meeting, and we need to have it back in time for that. With regard to the second action, that was around the ambulatory case sensitive comparator data, and I just think there was a bit of confusion because we were asked about why Q2 data was there. It's because it's 1920. That data is 12 months in arrears because it's nationally standardised. So that's why we were wondering why we could get Q2 ahead of time. It was because it's Q2 1920, not 2021.
Okay, thank you very much. We move on. We've not received any questions from members of the public for today's board meeting, so it means that we can move straight into quality and performance report, which Zena and Julie are going to present. Which
yeah. Pick up for part 2.
Okay, so I guess key messages really are around our ongoing focus around our A&E performance. That does continue to be a challenge for us, but we have seen improvements, and the challenge now will be to continue our performance well into the 80% as we go into winter and see potential increases in demand. We are continuing to see a differential in return of activity between the two sites, between Shrewsbury and Telford, and we are seeing the activity at Shrewsbury is pretty much back to pre-COVID levels. At PRH, it's remaining about 2/3 to 3/4 of what it was before. With regards to, as you can imagine, with regard to referral to treatment, that's still very much in progress in terms of our restoration and recovery plans. We're doing a lot of work over that over the next week, obviously before our next planning submission on the 21st, and that will start for the first time to give us where we're at against our elective and outpatient plans. Clearly, there is a long way to go to any sort of recovery of our 18 weeks performance, but we'll obviously keep the governing body informed as those plans become further developed. With regard to the diagnostics, I think we're slightly more confident of that. We've got notice that our colleagues at Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital have been successful in getting 2 MRI scans for 3 months over the winter, which will considerably help our recovery. And we also believe we've been successful in another bid for an MRI and CT pod, but that's only literally come through this morning, and we don't know of the timescales of that yet. So again, that's very much a moving feast, and we'll continue, I would hope by next governing body, we'll be able to bring forward looks and trajectories that we can see our progress against that recovery. With regard to cancer, we are in a relatively good position in Shrewsbury and Telford compared to other parts of the region and country. We have maintained good cancer performance during COVID. We have seen a reduction of over 35% in our over 62-day backlog during that time, and we continue to bring that down. We are having somewhat of a challenge with some of the 104-day waits, but that's predominantly down to patient choice and patients not wanting to go back to the hospital for their either diagnostics or appointments. And I would just like to take this opportunity to reaffirm that the hospitals are safe for patients to attend, and we would really encourage our members of the public to attend any appointments they have for that. It's really important that they do have those diagnoses and those appointments in a timely fashion. And that will obviously help us with that. And finally, we've had a bit of a hiccup around our dementia, not least again because of COVID and access into primary care. We have every confidence that that will recover over time, and also some of the plans that we had, particularly on the Telford and Wrekin side of the patch, will be able to. We've got some good delivery plans that were put on hold, and they will be reconvened. And finally, IAPT, again, we know that was severely impacted in Q1 because of COVID. We've seen some recovery in Q2, but that's really a focus of us going forwards in terms of how we can promote access and capacity for that service to support that over coming months. So happy to take any questions, or I'll hand over to Zena for the quality section, and we'll take questions at the end.
Yep, Zena.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Julie. So I'm going to talk predominantly to Section 2 of the report, noting first of all that this is month 3 information unless it's otherwise indicated. There are some updates within the narrative. And the first section really is all around Shrewsbury and Telford hospitals. It's quite a lengthy report in totality, so I'll just skip to points for consideration here, but happy to take questions on any of the content, really. The quality of care element at SAF, then, I think I will cover it, the SOAG report, which is the next and following on report after this one. Cancer services, then, we have 12 breaches of the 104 days standard, and the detail of that is known to us, and we have oversight of the harm review processes associated with those patients. I mean, I think it's fair to say that COVID has had an impact, but the Trust is kind of revisiting all of that in the light of the information that Dave shared with us earlier around capacity and demand and getting back to normal, really. So that's the cancer bit. For maternity, then, pleased to report that the Wrekin maternity-led unit reopened partway through COVID, actually, and took activity from the consultant-led unit, which we saw as a positive move. And indeed, home births were also reinstated in line with the national directives, which again has opened up choice to the women in the county, and again is seen as a positive. There were a number of things that were paused nationally through the maternity directives, including smoking at the time of delivery, and also the way in which women were assessed and booked in. And gradually those restrictions are being lifted, and the Trust is resuming back to normal processes for those aspects. I wanted to mention neurology. There was a meeting yesterday between SAF and Royal Wolverhampton to look at the pathway for neurology, and Wolverhampton have proposed a new model which SAF are looking at to respond to see how they might meet the requirements of that model. And I think overall it was felt to be a collaborative meeting, but recognising there was a little bit more work to be done. One of the points that Wolverhampton wanted to implement was a single point of access and referral, which we would see as being a positive step at this stage. We don't believe there are many patients in the system awaiting those kind of referrals because our pathways have been closed over the summer. So all of those will now come through that single point when it's established, and that's for SAF to respond to in part. I won't cover RTT in any more detail. I wanted to take a moment to talk about serious incidents, and this is a point that has been of concern to both CCGs over quite a long period of time. And it has been an enduring challenge, I think, to achieve sustained improvements on the part of SAF in particular. We feel like we've come to a better arrangement with the Trust around oversight and supporting and advising them within their SI process. We, of course, follow the NHS England and NHS improvement framework around managing SIs, so we have our part to play. The Trust, in turn, has its part to play to make sure that the RCA is fit for purpose, and we give them feedback on that, and also to make sure that those RCAs are done and completed in a timely manner. What is pleasing is that the number of open and indeed the number of overdue RCAs has decreased significantly in recent times, and that in part has been due to the interim chief nurse taking that on board as a corporate responsibility, and also changes to SAF's patient safety team. We have co-produced an improved process, and that is due to be signed off by SAF imminently, and we're hopeful that the improvements we have this time will stick. Just on a few other bits on the report then, around quality assurance visits in support of SAF. We do maintain a schedule of quality improvement quality assurance visits, and we have visited the Trust at regular intervals, as well as joining the Trust's own exemplar quality assurance visits on a weekly basis. Excuse me. So that is SAF. For Robert Jones Agnes Hunt Hospital, again, RTT features as one of the areas that we're focusing on. I won't dwell on that again for the same reasons that I explained around SAF. For MPFT, we're doing a focused piece of work around suicides and harms, and that's a system piece, and it's also focused on delays in ED, particularly around the CAMS cohort of patients, so that's ongoing. For ASD waiting list, Claire, did you want to cover the point in the report there?
I can do. The figures are as I've reported, but there's a wider piece of work based around the diagnostic pathways particularly, and then the pre and post diagnosis. So the funding, I believe, Steve, I'm hoping he's going to nod, has been released for the diagnostic pathway, so that should start and have an impact on the waiting list now, which has been a concern to all of us, I think, around that waiting list. And then I have suggested to Zena that we start and report some of those elements into the Quality and Performance Committee as a SEND quality issue. It will go to a number of places, but we just need to make sure we've got the right assurance in the right place.
Thank you, Claire. So moving on to Shropshire Community Healthcare Trust, our community trust then. The main area that we're working with the trust on is around the serious incidents and wound care, and there's sort of two elements to this really. One is to make sure that the right products are being used, and that's being taken through the medicines management route, and there's a bit of standardisation required there. I think the other piece of work to share with the board is that we're looking at this as a system improvement piece of work, and working in collaboration. What we're seeing at the point of reporting serious incidents is that often patients have moved through the system and have been held in other care areas prior to or post accessing Shropcom's services. So there is a piece of work to be done between the different providers, and the directors of nursing are taking that forward. The quality team undertook a quality assurance visit to our out-of-hours provider, and this is ShropDoc, as many of you will know. However, Shropshire Community Trust leads on that contract and subcontracts through to ShropDoc for the last couple of years or so. And we had some concerns escalated to us around patient care and governance and staff training. And so we took some time to thoroughly investigate those. We were a little bit hampered by the COVID period where we weren't able to directly visit and gain access. But we did do a visit in July, beginning of July, as soon as we could, and have gained assurance that all of the concerns have been addressed or are in the process of improvements, and that ShropDoc have taken these very seriously and have put the right level of attention to addressing the matters of concern. The details are in the report there. In terms of primary care then, so there's a table on page 9 of the report which shows the relative positions of each of our primary care practices. I'm pleased to say the high majority of our practices across both CCGs are rated either good or outstanding, and that's a significant achievement. There are a couple that are requiring improvements on the Shropshire patch, and we will be prioritising those for improvement and developmental work over the next 12 months in support of them achieving improved outcomes. Just moving on to page 10 then, a note on the annual health check. So this is an area that covers a number of the directors' portfolios. Not least the quality team will be taking a lead in managing the returns on the health checks and making sure that they're undertaken. And I think we have kind of lost a little bit of momentum over the COVID period on this. That said, I don't think we were quite where we needed to be before COVID. This has had a really refreshed approach. It's a multi-agency, multi-partner approach, and it relies on different care organisations flagging on their own internal systems when residents, for example, need to have a care review, and our part is to work with primary care to enable those reviews to be undertaken and prioritised. So we do have quite a target on that. I think it's our intent to be reporting in more detail on that, and I think in the table further down it shows the detail of where we're at. The work with care homes continues. We have no specific and particular concerns around care homes. Our support continues by way of the infection prevention and control input as a result of the Chief Nurse for England's call to action on that front, and we achieved that as required over the COVID period. Section 3 talks about the key quality concerns. Infection control again features. It's not going to go away anytime soon. It still very much underpins our forward thinking about how we deliver our services and how we work with providers. We've had our infection targets discussed but not yet published nationally, so we can only work on the assumptions that are listed in the report around what the targets look like. We've got no particular concerns at the moment. Safeguarding, nothing specific to report on this in this report, and there will be a fuller report next month. What I would say is about looked after children. This often features in our quality committees discussions. We have a high number of hosted children in Shropshire and a lesser number, but still significant in Telford, amounting to around about 700 or 800 children. And we're required to follow each and every one of those children up with a series of health checks. One of the issues that we do encounter is late notification of those children being placed into the county, and as a result of that, we often find that we are playing somewhat of a catch-up approach to checking them out. However, we do have very good professional networks that allow us to have line of sight of every child that comes in, even without of that formal notification from the local authorities. From the audits undertaken around the quality of assessments taken, they were found to be of a very high standard. There is information on compliments and complaints and concerns, but I will leave that and take it as read, and then happy to take any questions along with Julie on the performance data.
Thank you, Zena. Keith.
I thought it was very interesting in the NHS oversight framework that there was the comparison with peer CCGs, and obviously there's a range of performance in there. I just wondered if we've got a process within the CCGs that looks at what are the reasons why we perform more poorly, and maybe go to some of the other CCGs to find out what we can learn.
Dave?
Yes, I mean we have a peer group of similar CCGs in relation to demography, size, etc., and we do regularly look at that data and have discussions with some of those where they are performing better than us.
And how does that feed back into, say, the committees in terms of work, either Joint Strategic Committee or Finance Committee or Audit Committee, places like that? Because this is new as far as I'm concerned.
Julie's going to pick that up.
We've
We're developing this report. It's one thing, apologies, I omitted to say, obviously this is a new format, so we'd welcome any feedback. It is very much work in progress, so this whole section, I'm aiming to try and get sort of stratified between areas where we're okay, areas where we're not okay, but we're doing actions and we anticipate an improvement, and obviously those areas where we're not doing okay and we're struggling to get improvement are the ones we focus on. Equally, I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the things that we are doing well on, because I think there's always a challenge around performance reporting. You can focus on the negatives, and I'm trying to get that balance right. But within that section, that sort of comparative information and working on that and working on and prioritising what we need to. And again, that will go through the Quality and Performance Committee. But I'd like to set an expectation. I think that's where we need to be really honest with our capacity and our priorities, because we will not be able to improve on everything. So that's part of the dialogue I want us to have, which is what are the areas that we seek, that we absolutely need to film. What are the ones that we know, yeah, maybe we do need to make some improvement, but actually based on sort of resources, both in terms of workforce and financial, we can't, and we have to plan those for future improvements. So I'm keen to get that through the Performance and Quality Committee over the next few months, Keith.
Can I just add the Audit Committee to that as well? Because obviously we have the value for money conclusion, and I think at least annually it would be really helpful to
we could do
either do a report from the Quality Committee or direct from you.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, will do.
Thank you. Mike? Mike, I'll move him that way.
But thank you. Couple of observations. Firstly, if you refer a child for attention for ADHD, we can't now do it. It has to go through schools. So, but we still get schools sending things back to us saying we need to do the referral. Secondly, with regards to imaging, I'm really pleased that that's done. We still remain concerned about their appointment system because there were issues beforehand, and therefore I'm hoping that they will take it as improving on the old system rather than going back to the old system, which didn't work very well. Thirdly, if Wolverhampton is taking over neurology, does that mean we are decommissioning our own neurologists, or what is the future of their own neurologists? Finally, two things. Formerly, we talked about the district nurses and tissue viability. We're still waiting for that. We haven't had one back. They keep promising it to be sent to the practices. I haven't seen it. I have asked in the past for it. And finally, significant events. Now that GPs can't use whatever rubbish system it was before, we have written various letters still to the hospitals, of which we are still being ignored, which especially remains around casualties, certain events, which we've still not responded. So how you get these significant events in the hospital, how general practice and other services are going to be able to feed in to say some things which we have concerns about. Because Ulysses, we can't work out either, so we haven't tried.
Okay.
Sorry.
Julie, yes. Yeah.
With regard to that, the idea is that we're going to be integrating the service, but it's going to be hosted by Wolverhampton. So our the existing staff are the consultants are actively involved in those discussions. They are acting really supportive of it, because it does, what it gets us to is a sustainable service for our local population, and also for the people of Mid Wales, because that's clearly not been something we've been able to offer in isolation with just Shrewsbury and Telford, and being part of that wider centre gives us an opportunity to ensure that service and the timeliness of those appointments and that treatment, and the ongoing support then for neurological long-term conditions in the community, is much more sustainable for the future, because we know that's been a significant gap. So there is significant buy-in and support from the clinicians within SAF. Thank you.
Okay. And with regard to Ulysses and training for practice, I think Ulysses is the way to feedback significant concerns, isn't it, Zena?
I think I just wasn't sure about your comment about tissue viability. If you could just clarify for me.
Whenever we did a Cope Day quite a year or two ago, they talked about this formally coming out, which I've still not seen.
So I'll pick up with you separately then, Mike, just to
Thank
get a
you.
bit more information. Yeah, and then just to add to Julie's comments about the report evolving, we're aware that the last few pages are a bit black and white, and we do like a bit of colour, so we would intend to put some colour to that, and also where we're reporting exceptions and escalations to provide a trend so that the board can see how we've performed over a period of time rather than just at a point in time.
And Zena, the question about Ulysses and reporting concerns?
Yeah, I'm aware that primary care has moved over to Ulysses, and that would be the route by which practices are asked to report concerns. We do have the end-to-end reporting process as well, which is NHS provider to NHS provider, and we do receive reports on those. In fact, it's referred to in the report here. I'm not party to the rollout of Ulysses, nor indeed the training of that, so I'm looking around the table for...
Not a lot is the answer.
Deborah?
Mike, there have been simplifications of the way that you can report concerns, particularly around contract breaches in secondary care. And I wonder if that's what you're talking about how that's done. Jane Blay, who's the primary care quality support worker, can help with that, and also has offered to train with using Ulysses, which has replaced the old Datix system, which nobody found very useful. So I can put you in touch with her or talk you through it in more detail afterwards.
Okay, thank you. Lynn Crawley.
Report. I just wanted to let the board know that Healthwatch Shropshire and Healthwatch Telford Wrekin are currently launching a discharge survey to find out people's experiences of discharge since March. And we've worked with the multi-agency team on developing the questions for that survey. And so we're hoping the press release will go out this week, and we would just ask the CCG to help us to promote that. The other piece of work that we're doing together to cover Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin is an out-of-hours palliative care survey. And we're hoping that we'll get some feedback on the palliative care helpline through that survey. And then the other thing that we're doing is we're continuing our hot topic, asking for feedback on phone, video and online appointments, which we will hope to share our findings as soon as we've finished that piece of work.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Adam.
Just a couple of comments, really, for the record, I think. So, just looking at the performance data, a good bit, if you look at it, is that we are pretty much at the top of the group of comparators in terms of falls of the elderly, end-of-life admissions, emergency admissions for urgent care sensitivity, CHC assessments, delayed transfers of care, and above average length of stay. So that actually suggests that to some extent, only the right people are going in, and they're only staying in for the right length of time, which is good, but might limit the scope for improvement with frailty and other work. Regards to the ED bit, I just thought it's worth noticing that there's been a 10% drop in attendance at RSH and a 30% drop at PRH, and that difference in attendance correlates with a 20% drop in admissions at PRH. So essentially every 10% drop in A&E attendance results in a 10% drop in admissions. And if the drop in attendance was less sick people, you'd expect a smaller drop in admissions because the sick people would be getting there. And the reality of that, I think, is that every child with a temperature that goes to the Princess Royal gets admitted to PEDS, partly because that's quick and partly because that's the way the CQC has driven things. And so if we're going to reduce that, particularly with the cross-infection issues that follow from that in winter, we probably need to look at enhancing access in primary care. And the evidence from there is that 3 urgent appointments in primary care prevent 1 ED admission, roughly speaking. And then the third one's the surprising bit. For all our concerns about 52-week waits and waiting times, we're actually above average on waiting list size, 18-week waits, and at the top of our comparative performance for 52-week waits. So we do focus on the poor performance, but it's actually better than most, and that suggests it's a national capacity thing rather than anything we're doing. Just thought I'd flag those up. And then the dressings piece that Mike mentioned, there is work happening And if you look at the open prescribing data on silver dressings, I think it started in Telford with the wound dressing service and is gradually spreading across Shropshire. But if you were to look at open prescribing net, which I have got open and haven't found the right page, our silver dressing use, which is the expensive bit, is well below the patch, and Shropshire's just coming down, and it seems clear that wound dressing formulary is being implemented and is having an effect. Those are my thoughts, that's all.
Zena, do you want to make any comments on those? I think particularly, the point around the paediatric admissions at PRH, A&E, because obviously I would guess that it's not every child that turns up with a temperature is admitted.
I did an audit. I was really pleased in our practice because we didn't have any children who went to A&E and were discharged, sent back from A&E with temperature or anything. The only ones who got sent home from A&E were kids with head injuries. And then I realised it's because all the ones with temperature got admitted. 100% when I did it. It's a while back.
Is that something we need to look into?
Yeah, I mean, I can have a separate conversation with Adam to kind of understand the detail of that. With regard to wound care, I mean, one of the areas we're looking at is the more complex wounds, things like vac therapy, and the use of those products and standardising supplier. Is when you change supplier from acute care down to secondary care, it invokes additional cost and is not a great patient experience. So that's some of the focus of that work.
Okay. I want to ask one further follow-up question to the waiting list. I'm mindful we are running behind time and that we will have the break after this item because it will be sort of 10:30 and then we can come back after quarter hour. But I do think that one thing that may be missing from the report and also building as we move through into the sort of recovery phase is more detail around the waiting list and the recovery trajectories. Because I'm concerned about the rising number of 52-week waits and also the longer waits, and concerned about some of the comments in the paper around the recovery. And obviously, if we're not ever getting back up to 100% capacity, if referrals return to 100% capacity, then how we plan to clear the backlog, I think, is going to be a challenge. And I wonder whether that we need to think about whether we should focus on that at the next board meeting, have more detail in the report about that. Obviously, it will be coming to the Quality and Performance Committee. And my final point was I thought there was a previous requirement that the waiting list numbers were reported back to the public board. Was that removed? We previously had a regular paper with the total waiting list. Is that, Julie, that came from you before? Is that something that...
That's been suspended as part of the COVID, and we've not sure when that's back and reporting. But I think it's back. We can link it all to your previous point, and that's what I do think from next board. That is where we will have. We're working on dashboards at the moment in terms of recovery across acute and community services, and that in our progression over the next few months, and linking that to waiting list is certainly something that, as you would expect, Gold have been asking for and we're reporting through, and it's only right that we bring that to the next governing body.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions? Sorry, Rachel.
I just wanted to on the quality report, just look at the 4-hour A&E turnaround, and it's that significant challenges remain, that even though the numbers dropped, that those, it was still difficult for them to reach their targets. And as we know that the urgent treatment centres moved out and the public were pointed in those the directions, what will happen when they are recited back into SAF, and the increased challenges that will go with that. And I just wondered how we are helping SAF, as a whole community to solve that, with the fact as soon as they open their doors, the public will march into their easiest point of access. And are we driving this 111 link and the talk before you walk, and using those other digital solutions and the linking with the GP practices from 111, because we're getting very few booked or requested appointments from 111 even now, and how we're driving that forward and what the plan was with that.
Okay, Dave may want to update about 111, but Julie may want to update about some of the 4-hour performance.
So we are the second area in Midlands to go live with NHS 111 first. and this launch of that is on the 28th of September, although it will be a staggered launch in terms of how it's implemented, but will be fully implemented by December. It is clear that to enable that to work effectively, the system as a whole has to make sure that the Directory of Services is accurate to enable the call handlers in 111 to be able to send patients to the appropriate service in the community or community pharmacy or whatever. So there is significant work at the moment going on updating the DOS to make sure that's the case and make sure that the right alternatives are there, because if the alternatives aren't there, then clearly patients will still either turn up at A&E or NHS 111 will have no option but to send them to A&E. Julie, I don't know whether you wanted to pick up on the wider 4-hour issue.
Yeah, back to the 4-hour issue. This is one of the things that we're picking up through the Urgent Emergency Care Delivery Group. I think certainly it was raised, I think it may have been at the Shropshire Board meeting in July, and what we said there was that the challenge was when COVID first hit, you're absolutely right, the volume of activity did drop off, and we had great concern that we didn't see the level of improvement in performance that we would have expected based on that reduction in demand. What we did see, so that was probably March through to May, what we did then see was put a lot of effort, there was a lot of work with ESIST within SATH around their systems and processes, and we saw significant improvement during June and into July. Then what we've seen is kind of as activities come back on through August, and particularly the end of August and beginning of September, we've seen that kind of drop off again. So the challenge is, how do we've got to tackle both of those things. So we have to support, and that's why the priority within the Urgent Emergency Care Delivery Group and Board is around what do we do to manage that demand. And obviously NHS 111 First is an element of that, but also so are our developments of our community services around our sort of case management and rapid response, etc., that will help with that. But equally, we do have to maintain the focus on the systems and processes. We still have, as we know, some significant challenges around staffing. So what we do tend to see is performance is much better during the day, and it does drop off overnight because of some of those staffing challenges. And we have to continue to drive those improvements around the systems and processes, and particularly the specialties being involved in ED and pulling their patients back out from ED and onto the wards, and not just relying on ED to process those. So there's quite a number of things that we're working on that we hope will continue to kind of consolidate that. As I say, we need to consolidate our performance. I think we have done some modelling that said at the moment, based on workforce limitations, probably mid-80s, about 85% is probably the best that we can achieve over that full sort of 24-hour, 7-day-a-week performance. But the issue is we're down around about sort of 80, 82% at the moment. So we need to get ourselves back up to there. And then as the kind of the actions around the workforce improve, that then we sort of gradually see that incremental improvement beyond that 85%.
Okay, thank you. John, I need to draw this to an end because is this a different, you can raise a quick point, that's fine.
I'll try and be really quick. The first one, mental health, page 3, I think it's probably just subject to a typo, but were the staffing resources a problem or not? I think it should probably remain in place, but is IAPT challenged by staffing, or are we saying that the limiting factor is people actually accessing the service rather than the service provider?
Been resolved and have been resolved, and now the issues around access, so it's changed over time. We had some staffing issues at the end of last financial year, if you remember. We were there's around some recruitment. That my understanding is that that's been resolved, and it's now around access.
Great, thanks. So the second question was about the on page 7, the ASD waiting list. Back to that subject. I see there's a bit where it's saying that the sustainable future model for neurodevelopment pathway has been agreed and financial approval from NHSEI is awaited. Just some details on what we're awaiting in terms of finances there with the Commissioner.
Yes, please.
Yes, please, go.
Refer to?
This was the position that we've been sat in for a few months now, where in the absence of an annual budget, and an agreed plan with NHSEI, we've not been able to formally agree investment into new services. So the approval that's mentioned in the report was a response from EI that we were waiting on in terms of, in the absence of all those things, did we have their support to continue with that investment anyway? It took a long time to get that back. Regional team had got quite an absence of guidance from the national team too, but we've had subsequent conversations that have allowed us sufficient coverage to continue with that priority.
Gosh, that's quite insightful. And in terms of then the level of finance required for that service of investment compared with what our typical overall budget would be, was that very significant for that decision to be awaited so long?
Drop in the ocean, a few $100,000. However, as I say, in the absence of a formal signed-off plan and any direct national guidance, we act outside of our mandate if we don't get that clearance.
So is this reflective of how it is going to be for all our services? If it's such a small amount, takes that degree of effort, what about everything else?
No. As things are rolling through with the new regime, with finances, we're gaining more clarity on how we manage our finances moving forward. And I'll come back to a bit of that in the finance report. It's not all sorted yet, but we are starting to get into a position where we can take those decisions as we need to.
That's reassuring. The last thing was page 19. Just it's interesting having the comparative with other CCGs, and just the bottom section, leadership and workforce. I was trying to see where we are in comparison to the 11 CCGs, if I'm reading this correctly, and I'm going to probably make a haulix of this, but the primary care bit, numbers of GPs and nurses per 1,000 weighted population. I see that Shropshire CCG has 1.21 nurses and doctors per 1,000, and Telford Wrekin have 0.99. So there's quite a difference there, and yet Shropshire's rated 9 out of 11, and Telford and Wrekin 5 out of 11. And if we're reading these.
Different peer groups.
Have I completely misread this?
Yeah, there'd be different peer groups. They're matched against population size and demographics. That's your ranking in peer, and Shropshire and Telford and Wrekin are in different peer groups.
Oh, I see.
So there's a different. Shropshire's compared to Herefordshire and bits of rural bits of Staffordshire Moorlands, and bits in Dorset. And Telford will be, I'm not sure.
So you can't use these tables to compare Shropshire against Telford and Wrekin, because they're actually in different, they're ranked in different cohorts.
Yes.
That makes that really clear. Great.
So I think I'm not sure who the Telford 10 are, but they would be other more inner city type.
It's places like Warrington is one that immediately springs to mind. I think Mansfield is another. It's those types of areas.
Okay, now that makes sense. Thanks.
Dave, do you want to final point, then we know before we draw this to a close and have a sort of 10-15-minute break and start again at 1:45?
Thanks, Julian. It was around the money, really. I'm sure Claire will pick it up later. And notwithstanding that the challenge around speedy decision-making from regulators, nonetheless, it did require an investment when we are already CCGs who are in deficit. And as we go forward, where we have to make investment decisions or wish to make investment decisions, we are going to have to seriously think about what don't we do instead.
Okay. Thank you. So we're asked to note the content of the report. We are running half an hour behind roughly, but we do have an extra half an hour at the end of the agenda in terms of timing. So if we can have the break now and reconvene just at 1:45, so in about 10 minutes time. And I think if we wear our face masks outside the room, and the coffee and drinks are served at the end of the corridor, I think. Thank you.
Just reminded me that I promised that I'd make some cakes for the first face-to-face meeting. So I've made some cakes over with Sandra. They have been untouched by human hands, only mine. So if you want to take your life in your own risk, if you don't eat them, I'll take them to work. So they'll get eaten. So if you want some, they're over there with Sandra.
Thank you. Thank you. Begin to make our way. Not working. Can we begin to make our way back so we can start, please? Sorry? Well, I think we need to assume the reports are read. And just a very brief introduction, say this is the report. To make our way back. Moving to the next paper is the Zena Young with the SATH SOAG System Oversight and Assurance meeting update. So Zena.
Thank you, Chair. So in the interest of time and on the direction of Chair, I will assume that the paper is taken as read. Just for the background for this report, it hasn't previously been reported to either of the quality committees or a committee in common quality due to the timing of the change in governance arrangements. So this is a standalone report. This and similar reports would ordinarily go through the quality committees before coming up through to board. So this is a report on the SATH Safety Oversight and Assurance Group, which meets monthly, chaired by NHS Improvement, NHS England. And within that meeting, the system provides a slide deck, which I've appended for information. Much of that slide deck is populated by the Acute Trust, and we do, as the Commissioner, include some information as well. So just as the background to the situation at SATH then, the Trust was subject to comprehensive inspection during 2019. The report was published earlier this year. It was not a good news story, and since then they've had a revisit for certain elements around end-of-life care and care on medical wards specifically, and that was shown that improvements had not been made and further requirement notices were issued to the Trust. So the Trust is on enhanced reporting to CQC for the areas mentioned, and the key points I think I would wish to raise to this committee is, this board, apologies, is that we are assured in some areas and less assured in others, so that we have some confidence that the Trust is making improvements in some areas, and that's been over quite a long period of time, and that they're seeking to reduce the frequency of their conditions and reporting on maternity in particular, and are awaiting CQC to approve that reduction in reporting, which would be a positive for them. We think there has been mixed progress on the standards of care evidenced by their documentation at ward level, and there's a number of pieces of work going on here. There are policy reviews being undertaken. CQC found that the Trust policies in some aspects were not following best national up-to-date practice guidance. We're working with the Trust to help them put that right. as well as the other organisations such as the matron for mental health coming over from MPFT and others. So they're looking at the policies, they have revised their documentation and have a rollout programme, and we've looked at this during our quality assurance visits and found that some of the policy requirements are not fully reflected in the new documentation, so therefore if they were audited on their standards currently, they would not show the amount of progress which we think they have made, and that would give room for doubt if they were inspected by CQC. So clearly more work to do there. An area that we think they are doing well on is achieving the competencies in paediatric, adult nurses achieving paediatric competence, and they're ahead of their own trajectory. They've done very well on that, but what that has not translated to is an improvement on time to triage in children's ED in particular, and that is subject to a further letter from CQC to the Trust on their time to triage for both children and for adults. And this was a situation that we had advised the Trust that we were significantly concerned about and we were not assured on, and we'd asked them to take additional action. So there's an increased executive focus on triage for children in particular. We've yet to see that take a grip and be sustained. We do hold regular fortnightly meetings around ED in particular with the Trust. We haven't yet seen those improvements. And as I reported in the previous report, the progress around their serious incident governance and case management. So I'll pause there. As I say, I'll take the slide deck as read. I haven't authored all of the slides, so I'll talk to them as best as I can if there are any questions, and I'm sure Dave will assist in that because he also attends that meeting, as does Deborah Shepherd.
Okay, thank you. So questions from the board? Adam.
My only one really is the triage times. Is there any sort of benchmark that we're aiming at? The triage system at Telford certainly is one nurse in a room seeing patients as they come in, and you can only physically see one person at a time, so there will always be some wait. And I just wondered what the aspirational wait time was meant to be.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and it's one that we discuss with SAF at intervals, and in fact had a most recent conversation with them last week. So time to triage, set out in NICE guidance, is 15 minutes. So that's the time to triage. That's the standard. That's the Trust policy. That's what they're aiming to achieve. There will always be occasions when it's a few minutes over the 15 minutes. The important thing is that we understand how they are prioritising patients coming through, if there are delays to that time to triage, and whether or not there's any harms occurring as a result of those delays. So we're very much onto the detail of that in the discussions that we have with the Trust at our joint assurance meetings, which, as I say, happen fortnightly.
So Zena, it is also one of the CQC requirements in one of their sort of actions against the Trust is to have triage within 15 minutes for acutely unwell adults and children. So
That's right. So the Trust policy is set against national guidance. CQC will judge the Trust against their achievement of their internal policy standards and the national guidance, and therefore the Trust is found wanting, and that is why we're pressing them to make additional improvements. One of the improvements for children was to have a double availability of staff who can actually undertake the assessment. So they have that on every shift. They have 2 people who can do a triage and assessment of a child, and they have relatively low numbers as departments, and yet they're not able to fully achieve that. So that is 4 nurses across the Trust, 2 on each site, for low numbers. And some of this is about behaviour, and some of this is about documentation and writing down the time, and it's about standards, basically, and it's within the Trust gift to put this right. There's nothing else that I think can be done externally by the system to make a difference on this, because it simply is them doing the right thing in the department. So, we're as frustrated as I'm sure CQC are in that there has not been sustained improvement there has been improvement, but it is not to the level that is required. The Trust ask often about how this benchmarks to other organisations, and from my experience of previously working with NHS E&I, where EDs are subject to this requirement, it is usually as part of a suite of actions and concerns around EDs, and that would be the case here at SAF. But nevertheless, it's a key quality marker, quality and safety marker in its own right, and one that they could put right.
Okay. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Ina. It was a bit about the ongoing concerns with end-of-life, respect, DNARC, CPR documentation. I was just wondering if that's at all reflective on patients having respect forms that are mobile with them from going from primary care into secondary care, excuse me, or is this a concern of the completion of those documents and within the secondary care setting? It's just that the context of that and whether the system as a whole can help improve that. Because I'm aware that South has a small team that certainly have been going into nursing homes for primary care to look at the respect forms. So I was somewhat surprised to see if they have a team specifically for that purpose, that yet there seems to be a concern for that function within SAF and where we sit as a system with that.
Yeah, so respect forms specifically, there is a working group for the system that looked at the launch of the respect forms. I think the explanation for insufficient completion at SAF was around the way in which the forms were launched internally and requiring additional training. The focus group that is looking at respect for the system are revisiting the whole suite of kind of actions around respect. I'm not sure if Deborah wants to add any points to that, because I know it's something that you were particularly looking into, Deborah.
I think some of the issues are around training, and particularly with a significant number of locum staff. And so, although they have got the working group and the team, as you say, so there are people who know a lot about it. It's actually disseminating that information and training through the whole organisation, and for transient agency and locum staff who haven't accessed that, and that's something.
I think one thing that I would add, the respect and the MCA dole, the MCA form in particular, kind of go hand in hand, because it's about informed decisions and assessing capacity of an individual to contribute to those decisions, or whether or not it's a best interest decision. And the documentation of that is not as it needs to be fully compliant with the legal requirements of the forms. So whilst they've been partially completed, they're not to the standard required in every case. So it is a training and educational issue.
And picking up on Deborah's point, that's interesting, because later in the paper, the reliance on agency and bank nurses is roughly about, it looks to be about 50% of the workforce. And similar in ED, really, for the consultants. It must be a challenge then, I guess, if we've got such a reliance on a shifting workforce.
I mean, some of the mitigation for that temporary workforce is that it's the same temporary workforce that are engaged in longer contracts there. So whilst it's split into substantive and temporary staff, there is a cohort that are there constantly.
I think the other thing that was picked up in the CQC report is that at the recent visit, there wasn't on the wards they visited, there wasn't a high use of agency staff, whether they were. There was a good nurse to patient ratio. So I think there is in part, I think, as we've said, Dave and I have said publicly, is, we welcome UHB coming in to form the Improvement Alliance with SAF, and some of it is about putting in the right systems and processes. It's not about individuals, it's about having the structures in place. And unfortunately, we've seen repeated things where the forms and assessments aren't done completely.
I think what CQC commented on in the two reports that were published on the 14th of August were a degree of I think they described it as complacency, where forms and assessments are not completed sufficiently, they're not being challenged. You know, they're just being accepted by the next care delivery team. So it's, you know, there is opportunity to improve this, definitely.
Steve, got Steve and then Mike. Steve, do you have your hand up?
To go back to the triage or initial assessment of adults, I was just wondering, can you remind me what is meant by initial assessment? Is that triage, or is that just eyeballing somebody? And also, it's a bit concerning that those rates do appear to be going up in August, beyond what would think are acceptable levels.
So the time to initial assessment is an assessment, so vital signs being taken, and then a judgment being taken about which category the individual would be streamed to, and that's the triage process of that. The Trust do that as a united approach, so they do the 2-in-1. I think there was some confusion at an earlier stage about they were doing one part of it and not the other, and therefore it wasn't being recognised that they were having that initial assessment being done within the time frame. But actually, you know, they are doing the whole thing together now. So in some respects, for the walk-in patients, the data shown there that it has improved.
Mike.
Sorry, again, just a few comments following on from John's. Respect forms are quite a concern. Certain of my partners think that consultants in the hospital have no idea how to fill them, but I think that's actually in individuals. Secondly, some of the discharge summaries are absolutely atrocious, but unfortunately we don't have anyone to report back to them. That includes letters going to the district nurses, which can cause problems, and has done when people have been discharged home without actually us knowing that, or the district nurses knowing, and then getting complaints saying, why didn't you come? Finally, the issue which and so therefore I welcome your survey on discharge summaries, because I think it'd be quite interesting, and I'm slightly pessimistic. The other issue remains is some of the communication between when patients have been in hospital has been quite dire. This is not people just been in for a day or two. This has been for some people who have actually been that ill for several weeks, and yet there seems to be no real communication between the families and the doctors in there. And certainly, as an anecdotal thing, I saw someone yesterday who, if I read what was said in the discharge summary, I would have expected the person I came to see who was dying should have been was not the right patient to be seen, because they gave a rosier picture than what I actually found. So these are ongoing issues. We know that it is, and unfortunately it is. I'm not tarring everyone, because unfortunately, again, it is. I still think that although the system needs improvement, sometimes it is down to particular doctors what they will do and what they won't do.
Thank you. Meredith.
Thanks very much. Going back to my earlier question, really, so this is kind of a general point about the relationship for us with the overall delivery of the system, the acute system. Specifically, is UHB now in some way to be held accountable for what happens at South? Now, I suspect the answer is going to be no, South retains autonomy and all that kind of stuff. But there has been an associate medical director has gone in, the director of nursing has gone in from UHB. I'm just wondering now if UHB is part of the system that we hold to account for the quality and safety of services.
Dave?
I'm probably best picking that up, Julian. Broadly, no. However, there are committees in common now between UHB and SAF, and one of those will be a quality committee. So the quality committee will be a committee in common between the two organisations. So whilst they are not directly accountable, and nor should they be, because SAF is the statutory organisation, and this is not a takeover, it is an alliance to help them to improve. Nonetheless, there is an expectation on both sides, I believe, and the system as a whole, that the work that UHB will do with SATH will improve quality over time. And the expectation is some of that will be quick, some of it will take longer.
Can I just follow up with that question really? With this, obviously we've been told on a number of occasions that obviously we're the arbiter of system quality and provider quality, and that it's not, doesn't lie with NHS England or NHSI or with anyone else. So do we know how we're going to judge the success of the UHB and SATH arrangement, and what, have we got any sort of timelines and any sort of waypoints that we're going to use as a way of assessing, and do we actually, are we fully cognizant and aware of actually what UHB's role is within SATH, down to a granular level that we need to be to have that, not necessarily at this board, but within our sort of SOAG and through the CQRM, to be able to have that assurance that in fact things are improving?
So I don't think that there are a different set of metrics in terms of overall quality improvement than the ones we would normally consider as part of our quality framework with the organisation. The expectation of everyone, including the two CCGs and the system, is that we will start to see some significant improvement quite quickly. That's predominantly, or certainly a major part of the reason that UHB and SATH have formed this improvement alliance. My expectation would be CQC are likely to do another inspection, I would guess, within the next few weeks, certainly within the next couple of months, if not sooner, and that I would hope that we would begin to see some improvement before then. We clearly need to monitor the situation as commissioners of the services, but the expectation is we will see improvement quickly.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Meredith, any further questions? Okay. No. Okay. If not, then we're asked, thank you, Zena, we're asked to note the content of the report on the update for SOAG, the System and Oversight and Assurance Group. So thank you for that. And we move on to the next report, which is Claire Skidmore, and it's a report on the two CCG's finance and contracting and QIP schemes.
We have a combined report here which has the financial information for both CCGs, and it's for the reporting period up to the end of month 4, which is July. I just wanted to highlight 3 particular things from the report, and then I'm happy to take questions. So I'll talk very briefly about the headline position at month 4. I'll talk to you a little bit about what's happening in month 5 and 6 and beyond. And I also wanted to just give a quick update on QIP and how we're starting to have more discussions internally and formalise our governance around those processes as well. So first of all, in relation to the month 4 position, and if you remember from previous reports, we're not operating to the plans that we set ourselves as individual CCGs, which weren't signed off. We're reporting against a budget that's been allocated centrally to us. If you exclude our expenditure on COVID-related activities that we are currently able to reclaim through central sources, we were reporting a combined overspend to date of £4.6 million, being £2.2 million for Shropshire CCG and £2.4 million for Telford. The reasons for the drivers for that position against the budget that we've been allocated are set out in the report and have not changed materially since previous reports. So we're still looking at spend in excess of plan for areas such as individual commissioning, prescribing, and some areas of primary care where we were anticipating additional allocations, but because of the funding regime now, they're not coming through. And we're also seeing continued slippage against our running cost targets, as you would imagine, given that we've had to delay some of our management of change process. Since this report was written, we have started our work on month 5, and I'm pleased to report that we have now had confirmation and indeed allocation that breaks our position even at month 4. So you'll recall in previous reports we talked about having reimbursement for our COVID related expenditure, but for the other areas where we were overspending we still weren't sure whether we would get a relevant allocation to take our position to break even. That has now come in at month 5. In terms of our month 5 and 6 position onwards, we have now had budgets loaded into the ledger up until month 6. And for our month 5 reporting regime, which is currently being drafted, we're not being asked to provide any forecasts in terms of future expenditure. The national call for our numbers is purely about that month 5 position. What we have been doing internally, though, is starting to develop a view of what those forecasts might look like. But as you can imagine, we've got quite a lot of working assumptions that underpin that because of some of the uncertainties around the allocation we may receive for the rest of the year and the fact that a lot of our future plans for the rest of this year are live and in development at the moment, so we're developing those forecasts as we go. They're certainly not in a place to share at governing body yet, but we did report informally through to Finance Committee members earlier this month to give them an initial look at some of the thought processes that we're putting into that forecasting, but we're refining that modelling as more and more information becomes available to us. As of today, we don't have an allocation figure for the rest of the financial year. We're told that that's imminent, and my team are ready and waiting to take that number and run our modelling so that we can compare our forecast spend against the allocation that actually comes in. But some of the things that we've picked up in previous discussions, we are led to believe will still be in place. So we know there will still be a block arrangement in place with our provider trusts. We've seen the changes to the rules around CHC and individual commissioning, which we're modelling through as well. So we wait with bated breath, and a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment is very much tied into our system discussions. We're conscious that we don't want to be developing financial numbers that are done in a vacuum. We have to make sure that we're telling a consistent story across the system. The third point that I just wanted to pick up was around our quick processes, and I'll have mentioned in previous discussions the fact that we'd stood down our quick programme board at the start of the year because our programmes had been put on pause due to the fact that people's attentions were quite rightly turned to dealing with the pandemic and the situation that arose. We took a decision a while ago now that we would start to resurrect some of our governance for QIP so that where we can maintain our oversight and give our assurances around the activities that we can do to manage our spend in the situation that we're in. We held our initial QIP programme board yesterday, which is a joint board, and we'll be taking a report to the Finance Committee, the committee in common at the end of the month. And what we are doing at the moment is very much focusing our energies on those areas where we know we can influence them directly and we can make a difference on that expenditure curve. So I've had separate meetings with both Zena for Medicines Management and her team, Claire Parker with the CHC and individual commissioning team, and we'll be using the quick programme board and meetings in the intervening periods really just to make sure we can pick up the pace on some of those programmes of work. We had a really constructive discussion yesterday about also how we start to look forward, so we don't just focus on the here and now, we start to get back into that rhythm of developing our schemes over that longer time continuum, which we need to do as part of our recovery plan. And also some really good conversations about the fact that we recognise that the conversations at this board probably need to be a little bit fluid because there's a whole raft of work that's going on in the wider system that really will make the more material difference in terms of our spend in its totality. And what we don't want to do is duplicate conversations at our board that are potentially happening elsewhere. So we've got a commitment across the directors at that meeting that we will continue to refine and develop how our board works to make sure that we're as efficient as we can be in terms of the conversations that we're having. But certainly the report that we'll bring through to the finance committees in common will reflect those conversations that that we've had, and we'll report on the information that we've got to date. Last little bit associated with that, and it very much chimes with Keith, one of your questions from earlier today. We had a really good conversation with Julie yesterday in the meeting about making sure that we recognise the value of benchmarking in influencing and informing some of the ideas that we're developing. So we're very much going to try and develop that over a period of time through the QUIP programme board as well. So where we talk about looking at peer groups, right care data and all the other things that we're doing, we want to try and make sure that that's absolutely recognised and bedded into the processes that we're using. I will pause for breath there and take questions.
Thank you. I was going to have to remind you to breathe. but thank you. Questions on the... Can I ask one immediate question? So we're now, in point 5 of the paper, it says we had a month 4, we had an overspend. You're now saying that we now don't, we're completely clear of any overspend and we're on break even. I mean, that's a good position to be in for, in some ways, if not by a bizarre method.
It's a fabulous position on paper which says break even, but we mustn't lose sight of the underlying position that clears out, so we won't lose that. But we can... Yes, we've not had that in Shropshire for a while, Julian. We can take it if you want.
No, thank you very much. Keith.
Yeah, I've got a really good memory, so I can remember when we broke even. Just to reflect on the meeting we had 2 months ago, I think we were told then that clarification of the budget to the end of the financial year was imminent. So I say again what I said 2 months ago. I think it's really unsatisfactory of the NHS not to give clarity on this. I understand all the reasons why, but when we've been criticised for not setting an effective budget, we're now having that done to us. And I think that's really, really difficult. The fact that we have broken even to month 4 is good news, but I completely agree with your point about the underlying position and the fact that as it stands, the information that was presented to Finance Committee members did show that we were likely to have a significant overspend by the end of the financial year. So in terms of a message to the governing body, is it might look good at month 4, but from everything we've seen so far, we are still expecting to have another significant overspend. So the lack of clarity is really difficult. I applaud all the things you've said about QUIP, getting it back up and running, and all the answers to the queries that I raised from the papers came through gave me some assurance that we've got the right sort of processes in place. It's just difficult when we don't know the full context in which we're operating. And I find that really frustrating.
Yeah. I would agree. John.
Many thanks. I think one of the roles of the governing body is to probe for assurance, and so please forgive me if I gently probe here, but it comes back to the ASD issue partly, and how we are financing, and I was surprised earlier in the meeting, to find that we were having to ask for NHSE approval for a relatively small part of our expenditure for a pathway, neurodevelopment pathway, where it had already featured in a SEND report, our performance there. And Dave, your answer in return was that, partly or the point that we've made was that for everything we now invest in, we have to decide what we're not going to, what we will disinvest in. So I guess partly my challenge back is to say, well, are we then charged to ask for approval from NHSE and I for those things that we're disinvesting in? Or when we ask to invest in something, are we saying, and this is how we will balance it by not spending elsewhere? I'm interested by this whole area of where our autonomy lies and where it has to be delegated further up the train in terms of our finance. But I'm very pleased that we seem to be doing reasonably at the moment.
Do you want me to answer or do you want to answer?
You can if you want, that's fine.
But you're too far away to kick me. So a couple of points, John. One which may be clarification and one which I think will build on what I said earlier. The reason that we were asked to seek approval for any investment decisions this year is we are going over and above what the allocated budget is, and therefore that has an impact on NHS EI finances. And I don't think that's any different to any other CCG actually, or indeed any other provider at the moment, is because we've moved into this slightly odd world financially this year of block allocations. They all add up to the national NHS budget, and therefore any further investment over and above that does require that agreement, because clearly Julian Kelly, as the NHS Director of Finance, has to find that money from somewhere. So it's not, I don't think in any sense that should be seen as a removal of autonomy. It is purely because we are in a very peculiar year.
Okay.
But I suppose just building on what I said earlier, therefore, clearly, as we have gone through COVID and as we have made service changes through COVID, there has been an expectation that we would consult with regulators on those service changes. So disinvestment would be an obvious one. So we did talk to NHS England and make sure that they were supportive of, for example, the movement of the UTCs as part of the work during COVID. I think it is likely moving forward that where we were disinvesting in a service, it would be sensible to have the discussion with regulators to make sure that, if for no other reason, we've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's in relation to engagement with our population, that we've done a good quality impact assessment on the likelihood of what that disinvestment would mean, and we've weighed up the risks and benefits of that disinvestment. So again, I don't think it's necessarily about losing the autonomy. I think it's a sense check that actually you look like you've gone through the proper process to make that decision.
Okay, thank you.
Rachel.
Thank you. I just wanted to point to clarity on the prescribing and as a reason for overspend. And as we're now this new joined unit, is there one meds management over both now? So it's unified. I just wanted to clarify that. And and this prescribing, it's across the system, not just primary care?
Yes, so the modelling that we do is based on the national information that we get. We have one medicines management team or one lead, so we are standardising process. And say, for example, in finance, we make sure that we calculate the numbers the same way, so we've got all of that consistency through. I think certainly the drivers of the numbers that we're seeing are not local specifics necessarily, so it's our estimates around pricing changes and some of the cost pressures that we've seen in previous years, for example, where drugs become more difficult to get and we can only pay for the more expensive ones. So there's nothing in here that points to areas of inefficiency necessarily, and our QUIP programme aims to deal with that on a local level. These are more our estimates around some of the national challenges we're facing, and the fact that partway through they changed the rules and prescribing is now deemed to be non-COVID reimbursable, so it came out of the other part, not the COVID part. Sorry, that's quite complicated, but yeah.
So just sorry, clarity again. So this is not just a challenge for us, it's a national challenge. Is everybody having a prescribing overspend then?
I think various areas will see the impact in different ways. Some of it will be down to their forecasting and how prudent they are in terms of their forecasting. Some of it will be down to the population and the demographics, because it will be the call on the drugs that are influencing those particular areas of spend. Yeah, but we do, I know the prescribing team in particular have got some really good networks regionally, so we do keep on top of our, again, of our benchmarking, and we make sure we're being as efficient as we can be.
Zena.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, there's a certain element which is Brexit dependent, and the cost and supply of certain drugs, which is a national issue, and we take account of that in our forecasts around QUIP and the spend on medicines management. So just for clarity, I wanted to include that.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Claire?
suppose there's a couple of things around category M drugs as well. That has been a significant change in category M pricing, which is often used to fund community pharmacy contracts. And the other issue is around the use of anticoagulants. Some of the newer anticoagulants have obviously been used to prevent people going in to require additional phlebotomy services and warfarin clinics and so on. So that's had an impact on the prescribing budget as well.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions on Claire's finance report? Otherwise, we're asked to note its content. So thank you very much. We move on to a verbal update from Sam Tilley on COVID-19.
So just to take you through the current position in terms of the current pandemic, in Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin, we find ourselves in a reasonably steady state currently, but we are beginning to see small increases in prevalence rates. This is nothing to be alarmed about at this stage, and we are, however, tracking the position very carefully. And you would imagine that this may be the case given what you may have been picking up from the national media in terms of prevalence rates across the country. So it remains important for us to continue to reinforce the range of options for managing the spread of the virus, wearing a mask, washing hands, social distancing, and if you have symptoms, getting a test. And we're continuing to push out comms both with our staff groups and with the public around that. There are a range of testing options still available. We're aware that there are some issues both nationally and locally with some of these options, but we have been assured that these are being addressed and they are temporary. Again, we're working with our comms team across the system to keep the public up to date around this. We continue to run our incident management structure to maintain a multi-agency approach to responding to COVID. The main themes that we continue to focus on within this multi-agency response are around maintaining our testing capacity going forward, and continuing to offer IPC input across the system, and also maintaining our focus on PPE supply chain, and currently I'm pleased to report that the position is stable on that front. So you'll all be aware of the government announcement yesterday in terms of the return of some restrictions and how that demonstrates how precarious the situation remains. However, I would hope that the governing body will remain assured that we continue to have a robust approach to local management of the pandemic within those national guidance parameters. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sam. Fiona.
Sam, can I just ask you about the public communication, what's going out there to the public? Because what we see in general practice, there's still a lot of very scared people out there. They're listening to the general news that's out there, and they're hearing about all these outbreaks and, you know, levels going up. But how we can assure, you know, people in Telford and Wrekin and Shropshire that actually we're fairly okay at the moment.
I mean, I think it's well, we have a comms cell, which is where there's representation from across the agencies who meet regularly to assess what the current situation is, any specific comms that might need to go out in terms of changing guidance, etc., but also to continue to push out those relevant messages around how people can stay safe, and the action they may need to take. So in particular, Shropshire Council send out regular updates, several updates a day sometimes, communicating with the public around the messaging, the situation. I mean, I think it is a very tricky balance, because whilst we don't want people to be alarmed, and we have been relatively lucky, if I can describe it in that way, in Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin, that our prevalence rates have not escalated in the way that they have in some of other areas that we're aware of. we do need to continue to push the messages that the public need to be vigilant and need to take the right steps to protect themselves. Otherwise, the situation may not remain that way. So we through that comms cell, we keep regular updates around the messaging that we need to send out to the public and how we might need to nuance that depending on how the situation develops.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions for Sam? Yeah, Lynn. Sorry.
Comms, I think both Health Watch are just really keen to have more sight on what the comms is that's going out. I suppose apart from press releases that might come out, we don't always receive everything, I don't think. But as our job is providing patient and public information, we could help share any messaging, but we would need to know exactly what that is.
So I'm happy to facilitate those links. Leave that with me.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Because I would agree with Fiona. I think that the comms doesn't appear to reach everyone. You know, there may be communications, but that we need to ensure that it does reach a wider spread, really. And it is a very dynamic situation, as we saw by the problems facing the test and trace system last night, particularly in Telford, and the knock-on consequences that has, both in terms of confidence of the public and the impact on workload as well for our health services. Any further questions? Keith?
Given the rise in the prevalence rate and the work that Professor Tim Spector's been leading, where he's suggesting the R rate across England is 1.2, are we anticipating an impact on local NHS services over the next few weeks?
Julie may wish to come in here, but the modelling that we've been doing is based on reaching a certain percentage level of the surge capacity that we had at the peak time in April. And as we've been going through the restore process, and Steve may touch on this in a minute, we've been ensuring that services are able to step down appropriately to allow that COVID response to increase should we need to do that. So we are tracking through our health protection board and our public health colleagues how the situation is evolving locally, and then we are looking at what we need to do accordingly. At the moment, the levels are showing some increase, as I've explained, but they are very small. So we'll continue to monitor that so that we can make adjustments to services accordingly should we need to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Meredith?
Thank you very much. Two things. First of all, Sam, you said we've been pretty lucky. I think part of that luck results from very good planning and coordination and a joined-up approach across public sector organisations. So I hope you'll take some credit for that. Secondly, around communications, I wonder if it's possible, and you may have covered it and I just missed it, to review the effectiveness of our communication work through the experience of the people with whom we're communicating. And that could be quite a complex and resource-intensive activity, but just to get some confidence that what's actually being said is being heard. I'd be interested to know if there's any steps that could be put in place to understand how good we are, how well we're performing in communication terms.
Yes, thank you, Meredith. I think that's a really good suggestion. I guess part of it is timing in terms of when we might do that. I can certainly take that back as a suggestion, and we can look at how and when we might do that. And I think potentially there's a further link with Health Watch there in terms of how we might take that forward. So yes, I'll certainly pick that up and have a look at that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Unless there's no other questions, thank you very much, Sam. And we'll move on to Steve Trenchard, who's going to give us a verbal update on the system restoration.
So in this verbal update, what I'd like to do is to cover off some of the asks in the Phase 3 letter, just outline our current position in relation to services that have been stood down across the system, pick up some of the, I guess, the complexity of the process, just at a high level, for example, around clinical prioritisation, and talk a little bit about next steps in that planning process. So currently, across the system, across all services, when COVID first hit, we recorded in our first submission to NHSEI 103 services. At the last submission, on the 5th of this month, we had 106 services that had been identified for restoration, i.e. services that had stood down, had gone through a sift and sort of whether they're ready for recovery or restore. And currently, we have 47 that are fully restored, which is 44%, 36 that are partially restored, and 23 that are still to restore. So when we look at that across the particular providers, we can see that at SAF we've got 23 that are fully restored and 7 still to go. MPFT, I've got 3 that are fully restored, 7 still to go. The Community Trust have got 5 and 1 still to go. Primary care, I've got 16 fully restored. They're pretty much fully there with 1 to go. So across the whole system, we've got that position of, as I've said, just to repeat, 47 that are fully there, 36 that are partially there, and 23 that are still to come. So we had across, alongside Sam's planning silver and gold framework for decision making and response, we set up a system restore group. Since the last board, that system restore group has had its last meeting, and we've set up the 3 programme boards which were there pre-COVID, which were focused on mental health, learning disabilities and autism in young people, acute and specialist, and community and place-based that covers the primary care element. Those have now had a couple of meetings, and we've lifted and shifted the decision-making to for oversight of the restore process into those programme boards. The advantage of that is it begins to align some of the complexity and our response going into winter for the implementation of the services that are required. Also allows us to begin to think about the longer term. And just to touch points with the earlier conversation, particularly around our finances, we are a system, as we know, that's in financial challenge, and we can't just go back. One of the key asks in the phase 3 letter is to return back to where you were in terms of performance. We weren't performing particularly well before COVID, so there is a significant transformation challenge across some key parts of our services, across some of our key pathways. So that's work that we need to really begin to get under so that we take those services and describe those in our long-term plan. In relation to the, just say something about the clinical prioritisation, that happens at multiple levels. So one of the first things we did in COVID was to move trauma from SAF to RGH. That was repatriated on the 24th of August. That was a difficult process, I think it's fair to say, and there's been a number of meetings with clinical staff and colleagues from both organisations to think about the lessons learned and what we do differently in that space in the future. One of the key things that's being asked is that we, at all times, place the notion and our behaviours to system first, which means that we, in those meetings and in that space, we hang up our own organisational hat and we put the system on the work of the system at the first and foremost. So, for example, one of the key things that we're in the process of doing in relation to clinical prioritisation is getting a system patient waiting list so that we can address the backlog and the ongoing challenges in relation to our reduced capacity, for example, in our diagnostics and our elective space. In relation to the development of the system plan, as Dave alluded to, we submitted our first plan on the 2nd. I think we probably did conflate the ask in relation to where we were heading to rather than what our current performance is, and also aligning that with the some of the narrative, particularly around our winter planning. Since that meeting, we've had a winter planning workshop, which Sam chaired. That was a whole system workshop with local authority and provider and CCG colleagues in there. We looked at a number of schemes that we know have good evidence base. and help demand management, particularly at the front door of SAF and PRH. The current work that's ongoing now is around looking at those particular schemes that were prioritised through that process to look at what their impact is on SAF in relation to bed days, so that we make that right decision on that. So it's another example of how we're prioritising that work. We'll then be looking to the community boards and the other programme boards to be implementing some of those services. There is a challenge because I think previously we had a pot of cash that we could say, winter schemes, please come forward, and we'll spend that in that place. I think the challenge is the money is baked into contracts, so there is a conversation about how we do things differently and what we might pause or stop. And this isn't new territory for us. We've got through winter before by stopping, for example, some of our elective pathways. But that is another example of a clinical prioritisation process that needs to happen. We've got a meeting this next Thursday chaired by Jane Povey with her System SDP clinical lead hat on. And that'll be to look at those services that we have prioritised through that winter planning process to make sure that they reflect the best evidence-based programmes that we can put into place. We're just on a key ask is around health inequalities. So one of the things that we are describing in our narrative submission are the health inequalities that we face. And these are health inequalities, and we touched on some of them all day, for example, annual health checks for people with learning disabilities. But there are more. We face significant health qualities in relation to our rurality. And there are possibly new health inequalities that we might need to consider as well. For example, if we push the idea of digital first to transform and some of our service pathways, we may well be making some of those pathways difficult to access for those that don't have the correct kit. So we need to consider that in the round. The next step in relation to the plan is to get it in shape to submit for the 21st. So there are daily meetings underway, predominantly with Sam and Julie and myself and others. We've got a significant big meeting this week to identify the key impact of COVID on restoration and recovery from providers. So they're feeding that information back to us that we can then turn into a description of what will follow over the next 6 months. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Steve? Lynn?
Question as such, but both Health Watch were really pleased to be invited to be part of the restoration and recovery meetings on Fridays. But I just wanted to let you know that previously we had been invited to the cluster meetings, but we haven't had any invitations to any programme boards. So we feel like we've fallen off a cliff a bit, so it would be really helpful if people were just aware of that and considered including us going forward.
Yeah, no, that's...
Yeah, I can only apologise for that oversight. We'll make sure that you get invited pronto.
Thanks.
Okay. Any further questions? No, if not, thank you very much, Steve, for that update. And we can move on to the next two papers, which are Alison with the individual board assurance frameworks.
Thank you, Chair. So there is a joint report which is presenting individually the two board assurance frameworks for both CCGs, which are different. Just as a reminder for governing body members, the board assurance framework is a way of systematically capturing the risks associated with non-delivery of each CCG's strategic objectives. And the governing bodies, when they are considering the board assurance frameworks, should be thinking about challenging the risk ratings and target risk scores that have been presented, assessing the robustness of the controls and action plans identified, and ensuring that progress is made to reduce the gap between the current risk that's stated and the target risk that we aspire to. Just in sections 2 and 3 of the report, very high-level summary that there are no new risks for either CCG that have been added and none that have been removed, but there are some amendments to individual risks which are categorised there in the report for you to look at. Section 4, I just wanted to note really for governing body members that a desire has been expressed by both governing bodies in previous individual meetings that that they wanted to move to a joint board assurance framework as quickly as possible. I am planning that, but that is dependent on the organisational development discussions that we have started as two governing bodies around identifying joint strategic objectives. If you look at both board assurance frameworks at the moment, they are different in terms of the principles and the objectives currently cited, and it is very difficult to draw them together at the moment. So we do need to carry on with that piece of work to allow me then to start to pull together a joint board assurance framework that we can present to the governing bodies in November. And additionally, I just wanted to highlight that one of the actions in the action log for Shropshire CCG was for the executive team to consider whether the board assurance framework, particularly for Shropshire, but clearly we would look to implement this for Telford as well, needed to have an original risk score added. We've discussed this and agreed that actually it would probably be more beneficial to have in there the last reported risk stated, so that any movement is very obvious in the presentation of the information, and I'll make sure that that's added into any new joint governance framework in the future. Obviously, we will need to develop that new joint board assurance framework, and I would be looking for any suggestions that anybody has that they want to give me outside the meeting about anything that would help in terms of the presentation of that information. I know it is quite confusing sometimes, particularly the fact that we're trying to present a lot of information in very small text doesn't help, but we are trying to pull together lots of triangulated information to present you with as much information as possible. So any suggestions would be welcomed. And myself and my executive colleagues are happy to take any questions on specific risks in either of the frameworks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Alison. Questions? Adam.
I was just looking at 7716, sustainability of provider workforce, and I can't see an equivalent workforce risk in the Telford ones file. Apologies if it is there. And while primary care is mentioned under key controls, it really doesn't come across as a significant risk in the sort of action mitigations. And we do have a position where in a generation we've moved from 3 GPs per hospital consultant to less than 1, and having moved from being 5,000 GPs short of nationally of Mr Hunt's target when he set it to being 7,000 short now, and with a continuing fall, and with those under 40 emigrating and those over 50 retiring, it feels a bigger issue in Telford that has 20% less staffing, but we have workforce risks with sustaining business as usual. And if with the concept of future fit of a massive shift of work from secondary care into primary care, there has to be some money there and some people there to do that work. And I think the risk for the current model is high, and the risk for the future visions, the word I was looking for, is enormous. And I wonder if we could expand on it and that risk a bit more. We do have full recruitment to the local GP training scheme, but a high proportion of our recruits are from overseas, and once they qualify, Australia is somewhat nearer to Nigeria than it is to here, and it pays to us as well. So the retention of those people is very suspect.
Just a quick point. Alison, is there a tie in between the risk register for the Primary Care Commissioning Committee and this? Because obviously that's delegated authority, isn't it? So presumably there's a workforce risk on the Primary Care Commissioning Committee.
I'm sorry, I can't comment on that. I would look to Claire potentially to maybe give an update, but I'm not aware of it.
It's more about whether that needs to be kept separate because it's delegated rather than our responsibility, or whether it could be, because I think Adam's point is incredibly valid, but it should be there as a workforce risk.
It needs to be more visible.
But it's whether it's on the PCC rather than the...
Well, I think this is probably a debate we need to have generally about how the governing body has line of sight on primary care, given that we do have delegation on decision making for primary care in the Primary Care Commissioning Committee. So we do need to work out how that is presented both in the BAF, because there are general risks around workforce. I take your point though, Adam, that they are not highlighting primary care workforce particularly. It's more generic around providers as a descriptor, and whether actually, we do need something on the primary care commissioning committee.
Yeah.
But I think that's for us as an executive team to kind of work through about how that should sit.
Yeah, and I think there was one of the differences between the previous agendas of the board was that Telford had a report from PCC to the board, whereas Shropshire didn't. It was kept separate. But Keith?
Yeah, on Shropshire, did actually cover workforce as a key risk, and it was discussed very regularly. But I think Adam's raised a useful point about, is that visible enough at the governing body level?
Okay, thank you. For the, Meredith.
Just very quickly, I wondered if, Alison, you see some sort of process that the framework will go through, A, to find a single combined version, but B, something that's perhaps more, oh no, it's a judgment-laden comment. What's the process for moving forward with this?
So previously, Sam and I, in our previous roles before we became a joint executive team formally, had looked at this, and we had hoped that we would be able to pull some of these together to create partially a joint board assurance framework, but then perhaps with individual CCG still retaining some of risks that weren't common to both. But I think the problem we've got at the moment is that the objectives that each CCG have got do overlap, but they don't overlap enough to make it beneficial to do that piece of work. So we believe that the way forward is to start with a clean sheet of paper, which is why I've described the organisational development discussions that we have started as two governing bodies. Actually, in the workshops that Deloitte have described and developed for us, they are making sure that there are those discussions in those workshops around objective development. And from the objective development then, we can then start a conversation about, okay, what are the risks of not delivering those objectives? And actually, that process is fairly straightforward once you've got the objectives, shared objectives agreed, because the risks tend to actually be fairly obvious because they are very strategic risks we're talking about. These aren't operational, these are very strategic risks that are high level. So I see it as the first step is actually agreeing a set of objectives for both governing, for both CCGs by the governing bodies. That's the first step. The second step then is obviously discussions around what do those risks look like. And I'm sure we will have debates about the nuances of the risks, but actually my experience is that identifying those risks are actually fairly straightforward, and the debate is generally around actually the content of the risk, not the material risk description itself.
Okay.
I think I'd recommend getting us to be involved in the process, because then we can own
Absolutely.
its meaning and importance.
Yeah, I'm not going to be doing this in a darkened room, Meredith, honestly.
Okay. Certainly last time we did it in Shropshire, we had it as a board development day or sessions to do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Unless there's any other questions, John?
It's probably the nuances bit here, and keeping to the theme of today for my questioning, the 0 to 25 service on item 10. I was just wondering how the risk changes from red to amber, and whether that amber risk is appropriate, given that we don't really have an answer as yet to the outstanding risk of that particular service.
Is that on the Telford?
It's on the
shows 7816.
7816 on the Shropshire one, I think.
Page 2 of it, number 10.
Sorry, I'm just trying to see.
Well, not page 3 of it.
Okay, well, I defer. It's got Julie's name against it. I don't know whether that's correct or not. But I would defer to Julie. I don't know enough about each individual risk unless they're my own.
I suppose my question really is coming about making sure that the risks we're looking at on GBAF are aligned to where we see their current risk, if you see what I mean.
And I think that's the reason it does need a bit of a refresh. And I think there's a few of us in the executive that probably do need to go through this in more detail and get that updated for everyone's benefit. That's a good point, John.
I think, John, it comes back to the objective set that you base this on, and looking at the objectives that Shropshire CCG have at the moment. These look not old, but they look like what the current situation we're in has bypassed these objectives, and the objectives haven't kind of kept up with the situation we're in. So I think some of the risks that we've got detailed here are not necessarily based purely on the objectives that are listed at the top of the GBAF. So it can look slightly out of kilter, which I think is absolutely the right way forward in terms of starting with a fresh sheet of paper and new shared objectives, because then we can look at the current situation that we're in, not retrospectively trying to retrospectively fit current risks to previous objectives.
Okay. Thank you. Claire, did you have something to add?
Yeah, it's just to follow on Alice's point around the risk register for the Primary Care Commissioning Committee that Gary and I will, as part of the Primary Care Commissioning Committees in common, have a look at the risk register and suggest bringing a joint report to the governing body.
Okay, thank you. Unless there's any other comments, we're asked to approve this. There's sort of, as it's obviously the committee in common, there's 3 approvals for Shropshire to accept and note the content of the report and support in Appendix A for assurances purposes, review the updated strategic risk position and confirm the current level of risk is acceptable in line with the actions outlined, and note the planned development of a joint board assurance framework. So we'll be happy to accept those as approve those. And then similar recommendations for NHS Telford Wrekin CCG, apart from its supporting Appendix B, which is obviously the Telford CCG risk register. So, fine with that. Thank you. We then move on to another paper for Alison about the proposed changes to Constitutions and Governance Handbook of the 2 CCGs.
Everybody will be aware that both CCGs very recently changed the content of their constitutions and governance handbooks to allow us to appoint joint governing body members who are sitting around the table today, and to align our decision-making processes between the 2 CCGs prior, hopefully, to an application of creation of a single CCG next year. The process for undertaking that application has been lengthy, and in the interim various non-material changes have taken place that need to be reflected both in the Constitution and the handbook, which I've documented in the report, and I've also given the pages of the Constitution and handbooks respectively for both CCGs just for reference, but obviously if anybody wants the full copies, I'm happy to share those with you, and they're shown as track changes. And so mainly the changes are around recognition of the new role of Associate Lay Member for Patient and Public Involvement, Equality, Diversity, Inclusion, attendance by the Medical Director and description of the Medical Director role in the Constitution.
Alison, can I just add one thing? Is it worth adding on to that the CCIO role as well, which has been, can we add that in now as agreed to add?
Yeah, do you want to pick it up at the end of the report? Because obviously there isn't a recommendation in the report, so we just need to make sure we minute it as an addition.
Okay, yeah, I'll bring it up. Yeah.
There's also clarification I've added around the attendance of public health colleagues from both local authorities, which wasn't clear in the terms of reference for the individual funding committee. Because we're making potentially changes to both the Constitution and the Governance Handbook, there are slightly different approval mechanisms for both of these. So changes to the Constitution would normally need to go to both memberships for ratification. However, there is a section in both constitutions that allows the accountable officer to make non-material proposed changes that can be approved by the governing bodies of both CCGs and therefore do not need to go to the membership. and that can be enacted where they're not material changes, they're not trying to change the reservation of the membership to make certain decisions, and that the governing body is happy to make that decision in those circumstances. So for these changes, I've advised our accountable officer that in my view, they're not material and they are able to be signed off by both governing bodies without ratification by the membership. Changes to the governance handbook is a slightly different decision process. The governing bodies are allowed under the Constitution to make any changes to the governance handbook without any further ratification by the membership. So that's a purely approval process on the basis of what's in the report. Happy to take any questions for clarity. The other thing to say is obviously one of the changes that hasn't made it into my report today is the role of the CCIO, which we would want to have a standing invitation as attendee at the governing body meetings of both CCGs going forward. So my proposition would be that actually in the section in the Constitution that has a list of attendees, that we add the CCIO as one other attendee in that list.
Yep, and those on that page, Appendix 1, the lettering needs just changing, doesn't it? 'Cause obviously we've added in the F, we've done those changes. So the CCIO role was actually agreed previously by both CCGs, was appointed to as a joint position previously, and Steve James was appointed to that role before and has been asked to, or been appointed on what basis, Dave? Just to be the ongoing CCIO?
To be the ongoing CCI role till the new organisation, assuming it gets approved, comes into place.
So that's the Chief Clinical Information Officer. Yeah. So that was unfortunately missed off. So any other questions about these proposals? Recommendations? If not, again, we're asked to do both. So the recommendations and actions are from the Shropshire CCG and also from Telford Wrekin CCG are the same, because we've got a shared or a mirrored constitution and mirrored governance handbook, with the addition of the point that we've verbally agreed that's not in the report about adding in the CCIO as an attendee both to the public meeting and also to the private board meeting. So does everyone approve that? Please. Yeah, and for Telford, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then we move on to a paper about the appointments to the governing bodies of the NHS Shropshire CCG and NHS Telford and Wrekin. At one point when there's, I think just for the decision, do we ask Adam to leave or for the discussion of the paper?
Actually discussion and just to be actually technically correct.
Okay, so Adam, you get the privilege of having a coffee. But come back. Alison.
Thank you, Chair. So the paper is, in essence, noting the recent joint appointments to both governing bodies and listing those that have been appointed, noting the appointment of an associate lay member for public and patient involvement, equality, diversity and inclusion for both CCGs, and noting the requirement to appoint at the next governing body meetings in common in November the deputy chair of the CCG's governing bodies. The fourth element of the report is to actually confirm appointment to the joint role of vice clinical chair of the CCGs, which has to be one of those GP or primary healthcare professionals that have been elected by either membership onto the governing body to represent on both CCG governing bodies, sorry, I should say. That group of individuals, I understand, have discussed this and wish to propose Dr. Adam Pringle as the clinical vice chair. So the report proposes that as for approval, and we just need a vote to undertake that unless anybody has any issues or concerns.
Any questions about this? Otherwise, we can run through the four recommendations and actions that are required for each CCG. So for Shropshire CCG, it's note the recent appointments of the governing bodies of NHS Shropshire CCG and NHS Telford and Wrekin CCG is set out in section 2.1. Note the appointment of Mr. Ash Ahmed as the joint associate lay member, public and patient involvement for equality, diversity and inclusion for both CCGs. Note the requirement of the governing body of both CCGs to appoint a joint deputy chair of both CCGs at the next governing body meeting in common held in public in November, and approve the proposed appointment by the governing bodies of Dr Adam Pringle as the joint vice clinical chair. So, Shropshire CCG, are we happy with that? Good. And then for NHS Telford Wrekin CCG governing body, it's the same 4 proposals. Note the recent joint appointments to the governing bodies of both Shropshire and Telford Wrekin CCG. Note the appointment of Mr Ash Ahmed as the joint associate lay member of public and patient involvement for equality, diversity and inclusion. Note the requirement of both governing bodies to appoint a joint deputy chair of both CCGs at the next governing body meeting in common, and approve the proposed appointment by the governing bodies of Dr Adam Pringle as the joint vice clinical chair. So if we're happy to approve those, that's done. So thank you, Alison. We then follow a series of reports that are for information only and are as enclosures. So that's the Shropshire CCG report from Finance and Performance Committee in July, Quality Committee in July, Clinical Commissioning Committee in May, the North Locality Forum in June and July, the Shrewsbury Locality Forum in July, South Shropshire Locality Forum in July, the Shrewsbury and Atcham Locality Forum in July, and then for Telford Wrekin CCG, there's the Planning and Performance and Quality Committee paper from July, the Audit Committee from July, and the Practice Forum from July. So unless there's any questions, we'll take those as taken for information. And thank you very much. I've not been notified of any other business. The date and time of the next... Oh, Meredith.
Very quickly. Lynn asked about Healthwatch membership on committees, quality and performance specifically, and I'm going from memory, Alison, I'm sure you'll be able to help, but I'm pretty sure both Healthwatches for Telford Wrekin and Shropshire are on that committee, I think. I hope I haven't got it wrong.
I couldn't actually remember, Meredith, but I did have a conversation with both Lynn and Paul in the break to ask that we set a meeting up with them to talk about Healthwatch involvement in the CCG, but also their view of patient engagement more on a wider basis as well. So I'm going to pick that up and just check that we've got them attending the right committees at the right time.
No, thank you for that, Meredith.
Thank you, Julian.
Thank you. So otherwise, the next meeting Wednesday the 11th of November 2020, time and venue to be confirmed, and then we move to resolve the representatives of the press and other members of the public are excluded from the remainder of the meeting having regard to the confidential nature of the business to be transacted, publicity on which would be prejudicial to the public interest under section 1.2 of the Public Bodies Admission to Meetings Act 1960. So thank you very much for attending, and lunch is served outside, I think. Okay, thank you.